Do you want to make beautiful 3D animations in Blender? I was in your shoes just a few short years ago. I knew that Blender was a powerful software for 3D animation that gave you amazing control over the visuals in your animations, but I had no idea what the process of making an animation in Blender looked like. And because of this, I kept getting confused and hitting roadblocks every time I tried to learn 3D animation in Blender for years. However, that all changed when I got a series of freelance projects that essentially forced me to learn how to animate in Blender. But that doesn't mean it was easy. Finding all the information I needed to learn while also trying to find which parts of the software were important for 3D animation was incredibly difficult. There was no structure and no clear route to follow to learn 3D animation in Blender. However, that is exactly what I'm looking to change. Hi, I'm Crash, and I've been animating in 3D for years now in software like Source Filmmaker, Maya, and yes, Blender. My goal with this channel is to be your guide to learning 3D animation completely from the ground up using Blender. We're going to cover everything, from the hotkeys you need to press to the fundamental animation skills you need to know to create professional quality work. It took me an enormous amount of trial and error to learn 3D animation in Blender, but that doesn't need to be the case for you. I directed and animated a full-length 3D music video in Blender and have many other animations I've made using Blender on my animation channel. And I have a degree in computer animation. And through these experiences, I've learned exactly what you need to know to create polished-looking animations in Blender. But unlike college and many other Blender tutorials you're going to find on YouTube, I'm only interested in teaching you skills that I've used in real-world animation projects. This is going to be no fluff, no nonsense, hard skills and soft skills that will tremendously improve your 3D animation abilities. And I'm also going to do my best to make sure these tutorials are fun, interesting, highly polished, and easily reviewable. So if that sounds fun to you, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss out on future animation tutorials. So start today and happy animating. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video. In this video, we're going to cover navigation in Blender. If you're opening Blender for the first time, you might actually see a quick setup window that'll look something like this. Don't worry if your image isn't exactly the same as the one you see here. The default settings are perfectly okay, and you can always change these later, so just feel free to click out of that. Once you do, you will be greeted by the main window of Blender, which is the 3D viewport. This is the window right here where you're going to be spending 90% of your time in Blender. So knowing its most crucial functions, as we're about to cover here, is really important. The 3D viewport is where your 3D scene is displayed and where all objects in your scene are located. In order to select different objects in our scene, we can just press left click on them to make them our active selection. So if we press left click on our camera here, it will turn orange and become our active selection. To deselect in the 3D viewport, simply left click any negative space. To select everything in your scene, you can press A, or to deselect everything in your scene, you can press Alt-A. So A to select all, Alt-A to deselect all. But now let's cover the fun part, which is actually navigating our 3D scene. That means panning and rotating around our 3D viewport. There are two ways of doing this. The first is at the top right of our screen here on this 3D gizmo. If you hold left click on the 3D gizmo, you will orbit around our cube in our scene here. You can also click on any of these axes to snap to its respective view in an orthographic view. By left-clicking on the x-axis here, I have snapped my view to the right orthographic view, as I can tell by looking at the top left of my viewport. If I left-click on the y in the 3D gizmo, I will snap to the back orthographic view. If I left-click on the z, I will snap to the top orthographic view. An orthographic view in 3D is simply a view with no perspective information in it whatsoever. It's a completely flat and shallow version of the 3D space you're looking at. To exit the orthographic view, all you need to do is hold middle mouse button to orbit around our cube once again. Middle mouse button is the way I normally rotate around objects in Blender, just because it's so fast. If you hold left mouse button on this little hand icon, you will move your camera around the 3D space. If you hold Shift plus middle mouse button, you will do the exact same thing, which is what I normally press. So holding Shift plus middle mouse button moves your view, and just holding middle mouse button orbits your view. If you want to look at another object in 3D space, you're going to want to change your orbit center point. To do that, simply change your active selection by clicking on an object, then go to View, Frame Selected. Now, if we orbit by holding middle mouse button, we'll be orbiting around our camera in our scene here. We're a little close to our camera, so we can actually zoom out by using the scroll wheel on our mouse like so. And you can do the exact same thing by holding left click on this little magnifying glass icon at the top right of the 3D viewport. I'm going to make the cube our active selection once again by holding middle mouse to orbit it into our view, pressing left click, and then going to View, Frame Selected. Then I will zoom out once again by using the scroll wheel. The final two icons in our 3D viewport here are this little camera icon and this perspective icon, all of which have hotkeys associated with them. The camera icon lets us snap to the view of our currently active camera object in our scene. So if I click on this, you'll see that we are now seeing our 3D scene through the lens of our camera object. To exit this view, you can just hold middle mouse button, or you can press the shortcut for this, which is numpad 0, like so. So I'm going to exit our camera view and press the shortcut for this final button, which is the perspective/orthographic toggle. So if I press 5 on my numpad here, which is the shortcut for it, and use middle mouse button to orbit around a little bit here, you'll see that all the perspective in our scene is disappearing every time I toggle this. All the lines become perpendicular and everything starts to look very shallow and flat, which is very useful for certain 3D modeling tasks. I'm going to exit this view by pressing numpad 5, and that about covers it for this video. In the next video, we're going to cover the Blender interface, which is equally as important, so be sure to stick around. Let's cover all the most important aspects of the Blender interface for learning 3D animation. Understanding these will be crucial for learning Blender and making 3D animations going forward, so let's jump into it. First, let's talk about panels. The Blender interface consists of a series of panels. You could scale any of these panels at any point by clicking and dragging the boundary of a panel with the left mouse button, like so. You can create more panels by right-clicking the edge or boundary of a panel and pressing either vertical split or horizontal split. Vertical split will split your panels vertically, like so, and if we right-click on this again and do a horizontal split, and then press left mouse, you will see that it will create horizontal panels like so. Of course, we kind of just made a mess, so how do we fix this? Well, all you have to do is right-click on this panel here, and click Join Areas. Then, as your mouse is hovering over this panel, you can left-click it to delete it. I'll right-click on this boundary and press Join Areas and left-click on this 3D viewport to delete it as well. To change what's in a panel, all you need to do is left-click this little drop-down menu that's at the top left of every panel. So you can see it here, you can see it here, and you can see it here, as well as here on the timeline. For example, I can click on my 3D viewport and change it to the UV editor here, and now we can see that our 3D viewport is now the UV editor. I'll left-click this drop-down and click the 3D viewport once again. And if you ever want to full screen a panel in Blender, all you need to do is press Ctrl plus space on your keyboard, which will full screen that panel. Now you can see that our 3D viewport is now full screen. To edit this preview, you can press Ctrl plus space again, or you can press this little back to previous button at the top left of your UI. And this applies to every panel in Blender. So if I mouse over my outliner here and press Ctrl plus space, you'll see that the outliner is now full screen. And we can return to previous by pressing Ctrl plus space again. Blender also has a series of default workspaces for various 3D workflows at the top of our screen here, as you can see. For our purposes here, we're going to mainly be sticking to the layout, animation, and shading workspaces. So I'll go back to the layout workspace here, which is the default. And just so you know, if you ever mess up your Blender UI just beyond repair, it's a total mess and you don't know how to fix it, all you need to do is press this little plus icon, then go to General, Layout. That will reset your Blender interface back to the default. There are two quick menus in our 3D viewport as well. By pressing T, we can show and hide the Quick Tools menu. This is where our selection mode, 3D cursor, translation, rotation, and scale options live, plus a few more. You can also press Shift plus space to access this menu at your cursor at any time, which is helpful. So So I'll press Shift plus space and go back to the selection box tool. You can also press N or click the little arrow at the top right of the 3D viewport here to access additional quick settings. These are related to the transform data of your selected object, the tool settings of your current tool, and the view settings of your viewport camera. And as you can see, you can show and hide it by pressing N. Now let's quickly cover something that's very important to understanding Blender, which is the 3D cursor. This little red and white circle you see here acts as a spawning point for new objects in your 3D scene, a reference point for pivoting, and more. To place it around your scene, all you need to do is hold Shift and right click, like so. And to reset your 3D cursor, all you need to do is press and hold Shift plus S, then click Cursor to World Origin. That will reset your 3D cursor back to the default location. You can also adjust the 3D cursor's location and rotation values in the right-hand menu here of the 3D viewport by clicking the View tab, then going to 3D cursor and holding left click on any of these values. I'm going to press left click and reset this back to 0. I'm going to hide this menu by pressing N. Now let's talk about something that may be overwhelming at first, but is actually very simple, the properties editor. And I'm definitely not re-recording this section because my webcam was covering this part of the UI. This panel is at the bottom right of your layout by default, as you can see here. This editor contains several important tabs that are represented by different icons that change how your scene is displayed, the properties of your selected object, the settings of your current tool, and more. And hovering over any of the property editor tabs shows you what it's named. For our purposes here, we're really only going to cover the most important tabs for 3D animation because luckily, as animators, we really only care about a select few of these tabs. The first tab here is the Active Tool and Workspace settings, which lets us change the settings of our currently selected tool in the 3D viewport. For example, if I click on the cursor tool here, we now have a new set of options available to us. If I click on the transform tool, we have a new set of options, etc., etc. I'm going to press Shift plus space and then go back to the select box tool. The next set of tabs, which are separated from our current tab by a very small gap, are our scene-specific properties. The first one is this camera icon, which is the Renders Properties tab. This is where you change render engines, sampling settings, and engine-specific properties and other options that change how your final image is rendered from your 3D scene. The next icon looks like a printer, and that is because it is our Output tab. This is where you can change resolution, frame rate, and where the files you're rendering are being output on your computer. The next tab we care about is the one with a globe icon, because that is our World Properties tab. This is where you can change the properties of the sky or background of your scene in 3D. If we go to the top right of our viewport here and change the material preview mode to rendered, we can actually preview what this does. So I'm going to left click on this color property right here, which will give us access to a color wheel, which I'll make a little bit brighter. And as you can see, the background of our scene is changing. If we hold left click in any of these parts of the color wheel, we can change the color of our world. You can also change the strength here, like so. I'm going to go back to the solid preview mode by clicking on this second little icon at the top right of our viewport. And you'll notice that once again, there's a small section between our tabs here. And that's because the remainder of our tabs are object specific, meaning that they change depending on what object you currently have selected. I'm going to make sure I have the cube selected and go to this orange tab here, which is the Object Properties tab. Here you can change object properties like scale, rotation, and location, as well as object visibility properties. So if I hold left click on this, you'll see that we can change the location of our cube, the rotation of our cube, as well as the scale of our cube. And to reset any of these values to default, I will just mouse over them and press backspace. So if you want to reset a value to default in Blender, just mouse over it and press backspace like so. If we go to visibility here, there's a really useful one I like at the bottom called holdout. And if we click on that, absolutely nothing happens, seemingly. But that's just because we are in the solid mode for viewport shading. If we go to the rendered view, you can see that holdout makes our cube look gray. What this actually does though, is it makes the object you have selected render as transparent pixels in your final render, which is awesome and really, really useful for compositing. We'll touch on that in a later video though. So I'm gonna toggle this off and go back to our solid preview. The next tab has this blue wrench icon, which is called the Modifiers tab. This is where predefined modifiers that manipulate the objects in your scene live. All you need to do is click Add Modifier here, and for example, I will do a Subdivision Surface modifier, and I'll click Add Modifier again and do a Solidify modifier. What makes modifiers in Blender so powerful is that they're completely non-destructive, which basically just means that you can always turn them off or delete them and have your object go back to its original state. You can toggle previewing of these modifiers in your 3D viewport by clicking this little monitor icon, and you can drag around the order of your modifiers by holding left click on this section right here and moving them around like so. I'm going to get rid of both of these modifiers by pressing this little X icon. The next tab we care about is the one that looks like a blue bike chain right here. This is the Object Constraint Properties tab. This is used to control object properties like its location, rotation, and scale using its own values or the values of another object, which is referred to as the target object. So if we click on Add Object Constraint and see these constraints that are labeled Copy, that's what they're doing. They're copying the values of another object. This is occasionally used for camera animation and for other object animation purposes. This green... The next tab is also really important. It kind of looks like a flux capacitor, and it's called the Object Data Properties tab. This is where you change object mesh data, shape keys, vertex group, aka weights, UV maps, as well as geometry specific settings. Your object's mesh data is exactly what it sounds like. It's the 3D object data that makes up your mesh. For example, the object data of a cube is different than the object data of a sphere. And you don't have to follow along with this, but I will spawn in a sphere. I'll move it to the right. And if I left click on my cube again and go to the Object Data tab here, you can see that we can actually click on sphere and our cube now looks like a sphere. I will undo that, left click on our sphere and delete it by pressing the delete button, and left click on our cube once more. Next up, we have shape keys, which are used to deform objects into new shapes for animation. They're also referred to as blend shapes or morph targets. You can make a new shape key by pressing the plus button next to this shape key section. And I'm actually going to create two new shape keys here because the first shape key essentially will act as my basis that all other shape keys will refer back to. So let's press the plus button here and change the value from 0 to 1 by holding left click right here. You don't have to follow along with this, but I'm going to go to edit mode by pressing tab, left click on a vertice, press G to move it, press left click to confirm that move, then go back into object mode by pressing tab. Now something interesting will happen. If I change the value of this from 0 to 1, you can see that the change we just made to the model is an animatable property. This right here is typically how character rigs are animated in Blender. A modeler will take the face of a character model and they'll make a series of shape keys for different mouth shapes, eye shapes, eyebrow positions, and tie those shape keys into a character rig using drivers. We'll talk about those in a future video though. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have our material tab, which looks like this checkered red sphere we have here. Again, we're not going to see these changes update unless we go back to the rendered view. This is where you control many object settings related to how your object is shaded during a render. This is where you can change object color, roughness, glossiness, transparency, and more. So if I left click on the base color here, you will see that our cube can be any color we want. And if I scroll down here, you'll see even more options we have. For example, if I set metallic to 1, our cube becomes metallic, but I'll reset the color back to gray. The last panel I want to quickly cover in this video is the outliner, which is the one that's been staring us in the face at the top right of our screen this whole time. This is where all objects in our scene are located. You can specify which objects are visible here by clicking this little icon next to them, and you can create new collections here. You can think of a collection as a folder, which you can use to organize objects in your 3D scene with. I'll click this new collection icon to create a new folder like this, and I'll rename it by double-clicking on it and calling it tutorial. If you want to change the color of a collection, you can just right-click on it. For example, I'll do pink for this collection. I'll right-click on this collection, make this blue. And you can hide the contents of a collection by left-clicking this little arrow icon and you can put new objects in the collection by holding left click and clicking and dragging them over a collection and releasing. Now if I hide this, you can see that our tutorial collection is now in this collection. To drag it out, all you have to do is hold left click and drag it over the main scene collection right here. That about covers it though. In the next video, we're going to cover transforms, which is how all animation in Blender is accomplished. So I'll see you there. In this video, we're going to talk about transforms in Blender. Transforms are used to modify the position, rotation, and scale of characters and objects in Blender. And this is essentially how all character animation and object animation in Blender is accomplished. Mastering transforms is crucial for all types of Blender animation, so let's jump into it. In Blender, there are 3 types of transforms: translation, rotation, and scale. Translation in Blender is simply done by pressing the G key when you have an actively selected object. So as you can see here, I just pressed the G key with my cube selected, and just by moving my mouse around, my cube is moving around in space. To confirm this movement, all I need to do is press the left mouse button on my mouse. Now you can see that it has stopped moving and we have confirmed this position of the cube. To undo that change, all I needed to press is Ctrl plus Z on my keyboard. And again, all I need to do to move an object is press G, then move it using my mouse, and then press left click to confirm. If I press G and then right click, it actually cancels that movement. So G plus right click cancels a movement, and G plus left click confirms a movement. I'm going to press Ctrl plus Z to undo those changes. To rotate an object in Blender, this one's really easy to remember. You just press R on your keyboard. Now, if you move your mouse around, you can see that your object will start rotating in space like so. And again, to confirm that placement, you just press left mouse button. And if you press right mouse button after you press R, it will cancel that. So I'm going to press Ctrl plus Z to undo that once again. To scale an object in Blender, you just press S on your keyboard, then move your mouse. And once again, to confirm a scale, all you need to do is press the left mouse button. I'm going to undo that by pressing Ctrl plus Z. You can also do more precision movements in Blender. For example, if I press G, then press X, then move my mouse, you will see that we are just moving our cube along the X axis. And then if I press Y, we will only move our cube along the Y axis. And if I press Z, we will only move our cube along the Z axis. I'm going to press right click to cancel that move. And this also works for rotation. So if I press R on my keyboard and then press Y, you'll see that if we move our mouse now, it will only rotate our cube along the Y axis. And the cool part about rotations is that, say you want a rotation exactly 35 degrees, you can just type in 35 on your keyboard. You just type 35, then press Enter to confirm that placement. I'm going to undo that by pressing Ctrl plus V. The same works for scale. If I press S on my keyboard, then type in 5, it will enlarge our cube exactly 5 times. And I can press Enter to confirm that change. I'll press Ctrl plus Z to undo that change in this case though. You can also place what are called keyframes for these transforms in Blender using the I key. You can remember that as insert. So if you want to insert a keyframe, you can press I. What's a keyframe though? A keyframe is basically a marker of time that stores the value of a property and defines the starting and ending point of a transition of one of our previously mentioned transforms, that being translation, rotation, and scale. That sounds pretty complicated, I know, but trust me, this is actually pretty simple. To show you what I mean, I'm going to add another object to our scene and actually delete our cube. So I'm going to press X on my keyboard here, and this little dialog box will pop up, and I'll just press left click to delete our cube. To add new objects in Blender, you need to open the Add dialog, which is done using Shift plus A. This is where you add meshes, lights, new cameras, and more to your scene. In this case, I'm just going to go to the Mesh dropdown for this menu. Then I'm going to hover on down to Cylinder. And then I'll press left click to spawn in a cylinder. In order to make a keyframe on this cylinder, I will press the Insert Keyframe button, which is I. This opens the Insert Keyframe menu. And in this case, for the animation I'm about to make, I actually want a key location, rotation, and scale. So I'll click on this option right here to insert a location, rotation, and scale keyframe. And as you can see, if we make this a little bit bigger, this little timeline panel we have at the bottom of our window here, you will see this little orange dot. That is the keyframe for this cylinder that we just placed. And it placed it on frame 1 because that's where our playhead and currently active frame is. So for example, if we went to frame 120 here, and then we pressed I, then clicked on location, rotation, and scale, again, you will see that there is another keyframe at frame 120 right here. And you can see your current frame by going to this little box right here, which is the current frame value on our timeline. Now I'm going to rotate our object, translate our object, and scale our object. To do that, I am just going to move our camera a little bit, and press G, move my mouse, then press left click to move our object. I'm going to press R, move my mouse a bit just in circles like this. Then I'm going to press left click to rotate our object. Then I'm going to press S, move my mouse like so. Just it's a little janky here, but just kind of down like that. Then I'm press left click to confirm that. However, it's really important that I press I, then go to location, rotation, and scale, and click that to confirm all the changes I just made. One of the biggest mistakes beginner animators make is forgetting to do that and then losing a bunch of progress, and it can be really frustrating. There is something you can do to resolve that problem though, and that's with this button right here. This is called auto keying, and personally when I animate, I always have this on. What this does is automatically create keyframes whenever you make a change to any object's location, rotation, or scale. What that basically means is that if I click this button on, then I go to frame, let's say 190 here. Then if I press G to move our object, R to rotate our object, and S to scale our object, I do not need to go press I to insert the location, rotation, and scale for those changes. It is done for me automatically because I enabled that option. So I'm just gonna mouse out of this menu and watch back our beautiful animation. So to do that, we're gonna wanna go back to the first frame in our timeline here. And that's done with this little jump to endpoint button at the top of our timeline window here. So I'm gonna click on that, and to play back our animation, all you need to do is either press spacebar or click this little play animation button on our timeline. So I'm going to click that using left click. And as you can see, our beautiful animation is now playing back before us. I'm going to just press left click on this or just spacebar again to pause the animation. And that's it. That is how you animate everything in Blender. This might be a simple cylinder, but this is also exactly how you animate characters in Blender. All you're doing is adjusting the position, rotation, and scale of objects, then keyframing them in time using a timeline. This is how all animation is done. And now that we've covered all the basics, in the next video, we're going to finally begin our deep dive into animation in Blender specifically. And I'm really excited to do that. So make sure you're subscribed and check out my Patreon if you want access to an exclusive Discord community and a whole lot more. Thanks for watching. Let's talk about Blender's motion editors, which let you play back, modify, and move keyframes in order to change the timing of your animations and more. And there are actually 3 different motion editors in Blender: the Timeline, Dopesheet, and Graph Editor. Each 3 of these motion editors offer different ways to manipulate your animations, and all of them are useful and worth learning in their own right. I personally use all 3 of them constantly. In this first video though, we're going to deep dive into the Timeline because it's the animation editor you're going to be using the most, and it's very powerful. So let's jump into it. For this tutorial, we are once again in the default Blender scene. If you need to reset your scene in Blender, all you need to do is press Ctrl+N on your keyboard, and then click General. That makes a new scene in Blender. You can remember that as Ctrl+New to create a new scene in Blender. In the last video, we talked about keyframes in translation, rotation, and scale, and how they're the core of all animation you're going to be creating in Blender. We also talked about the auto keying option on the timeline and how it can be used to automatically place keyframes as you transform, rotate, and scale objects in Blender. We also mentioned how keyframing objects and characters in Blender are done through the exact same process of translating, rotating, and scaling objects. Or in the case of characters, their objects are called bones or controllers. The timeline helps us with this in a few different ways, because it lets us manipulate all the keyframes in our scene and lets you play back and preview your animations. To play back an animation on your timeline, all you need to do is press the spacebar button. And as you can see by looking at the bottom of our screen here, our playhead is now going left to right, which means that our animation is playing back. We're going to pause that by pressing spacebar again. However, our timeline's pretty small here, so I'm going to mouse over the top of it and hold left click to make it bigger. So I'm going to hold left click here and then move my mouse up and release like so. So I'm going to press I to open the Insert Keyframe menu. Then I'm going to click on Location, Rotation, and Scale, like so. Then I'm going to move my timeline to frame 250. Or excuse me, I'm going to move my playhead to frame 250. And to do that, I can either click along this little film strip at the top of the timeline, like so. That is one way to move our timeline around. Or I can hold left click on this current frame option on the timeline. And as you can see, I kind of just move around like so if I hold left click and drag my mouse left and right. I can also click on this once and punch in any number I want. So I can type 250, which is the end frame of our timeline right now, and press enter. That puts our playhead on the very final frame. And because I don't want to manually insert keyframes every time I move my cube, I'm going to click on this little auto keying option right here. So now if I move my cube by pressing G, moving my mouse and pressing left click, you'll see that a little keyframe has been placed at our playhead. I'm going to rotate our cube by using R, left click to confirm, and I'm going to scale our cube using S, make it bigger, and hold left click to confirm, or just press left click rather. Now let's play back our animation once again by pressing spacebar. As you can see, our cube is doing exactly what we want it to do, though very, very slowly. And the moment our playhead gets to frame 250, it's going to auto repeat and go back to the first frame. So it's going to infinitely loop what we just made. So let's make this animation faster. To do that, I'm going to want to move this keyframe over. To do that, all I need to do is press left click on this keyframe, so it's our active selection, making sure that it's just this keyframe and not the first one. We can tell because it's orange and this first keyframe is white, which means that this is not selected, but this is selected. Then I'm going to press G to move. So just like we press G to move this cube in the 3D viewport, you press G to move keyframes in the timeline. So now that I press G, I can just move my mouse like so, and our keyframe will start moving around on our timeline. And the further to the left we move our keyframe, the faster our animation is actually going to be. So I'm going to move this to frame 30 right here. To confirm my movement, just like in the 3D viewport, I just pressed left click like so. So if we play back our animation here, you're going to see that every frame after frame 30 is just a bunch of dead space where absolutely nothing is happening. And we don't really want that, right? So to fix that, all we need to do is press space to pause our animation again. I'm going to punch in 30 on the current frame value right here. Then I'm going to peruse my way over to the start and end frame options on the timeline. The start and end frame options do exactly what you might expect. They dictate where the start frame on your animation is and where the end frame on your animation is. So if we wanted our frame to end on frame 30, which we do in this case, all we need to do is click on end right here, then type in 30 and press enter. Now if we play back our animation by pressing space, you'll see that this animation is playing back much faster, which is kind of what you want when you're animating. You don't want any dead space after your animation is finished because it allows you to iterate and improve your animation a lot faster when only the part of the animation you want to be working on is in your current frame range. And thankfully for us, Blender even has a feature that makes this even easier and more useful. So I'm going to pause my animation by pressing spacebar, and then we're going to see this little stopwatch icon right here. This is what's called Use Preview Range, which is an amazing tool for previewing specific sections of an animation. For example, say I wanted to modify just this part of the animation and really refine it. Say it was like lip sync or a character landing on the ground. And it's like that part of the animation in particular is what we want to work on. To make sure that we're just playing back that part of the animation, we can click this little stopwatch icon. Now, if we change our start and end frames, it will only be affecting the preview range, not the overall length of our animation. So if I hold left click here and drag this back to say frame 20, and if I hold left click here and drag this to say frame 10, then I press spacebar, we're just going to be playing back from frame 10 to 20 here. And then if I press spacebar again and click the stopwatch again, you'll see that that completely disappears and we're back to the original length of our animation, which is so useful and an amazing feature of Blender. So if I click this once again, we'll see just be at the center. And if I click this again, it's going to be the full animation. Very useful for polishing animations up. So I'm going to press spacebar to pause once again. And while we have actually made our play range much smaller, the side effect of this is that it's actually really small in our Blender window. This is only taking up a very small percentage of our screen real estate, which we don't want. So to fix that, all you need to do is scroll up with your mouse wheel like so. And of course, now we can't see anything. So to fix that, all you need to do is press middle mouse button and then drag like so, and then release. So middle mouse button, drag, and release. That kind of moves you around on your timeline. Or you can use this little scroll wheel at the bottom here, and then hold left click on it and drag it over. Or at least that's what it would do if I selected the middle of this scroll wheel. This is actually what zooming does. So if I zoom in and makes this smaller or bigger, like so. So I'm going to click on the center of this time, then move it over. Now you can see this is a lot bigger and there's a lot more space to work in. You actually might not see your keyframes right now. And if that's the case, do not freak out. That's just a really annoying part of the timeline where if you hold middle mouse button and go a little bit down like so, you just don't see your keyframes anymore and it looks like they've just completely disappeared. All you need to do to get your keyframes back most of the time is hold middle mouse button, drag down, and there they are. And of course, make sure that the cube is your active selection in the 3D viewport as well, because the keyframes will also be hidden if it's not your active selection. You can also adjust the playhead in the timeline by holding Alt plus middle mouse button. So as you can see, we're scrubbing through our animation like so. Or you can use the left and right arrow keys like so. Plus, you can change the start frame in your animation by pressing the hotkey Control plus Home. And as you can see, our start frame is now where our playhead was, which was frame 15. And if I wanted to change the end frame, I can go to frame 26, for example, here, and then press Control plus End. That changes our end frame. But of course, I'm going to undo that by pressing Control plus Z, and then press Control plus Z once again. Actually, twice. And there's a few other really useful functions of keyframes that we should touch on. The first is that by left-clicking a keyframe and making sure it's our active selection, and we can tell it is in this case because it's orange, and then pressing Shift plus D on our timeline, this actually duplicates our keyframe. So now if I move my mouse around, just like duplicating an object in Blender, this works exactly the same way. So I've actually duplicated this last keyframe we have on our cube. So I'm going to move it back to frame 15 here and confirm it by pressing left click. Now if we play back our animation by pressing space, our cube gets to its biggest size much faster. I'm going to pause the animation by pressing space once again. Then I'm going to hold left click in our timeline to do a box selection, which is really useful for when you want to select multiple keyframes at once, like so. So now I have all the keyframes in my scene selected. I'm going to actually go to frame 1 to show you guys something really cool. Just like we can scale objects in the 3D viewport, we can also scale keyframes. So if I press S in our timeline, then type in 2, we have just doubled the space between all of our keyframes. I'm going to confirm that by pressing Enter. And now if we play back our animation, it's playing back at half the speed that it used to be, which is really useful for things like slow motion shots. I'm going to press spacebar and undo that by pressing Control plus Z. To delete a keyframe in Blender, all you need to do is click on it so that it's your active selection, then either press Delete on your keyboard or X. X has this little dialog box that asks you if you want to delete the keyframe. You just press left click on it like so, and now you can see that if we play back our animation, that keyframe is no longer there. Another really useful function in the timeline are markers, which you can create by pressing M. So now, At the bottom of our timeline here, there's this very small little black section, which does not exist if you have no markers in your scene. This black section of the timeline only gets created after you create your first marker. So this marker right here says F_19 on it, which stands for frame 19. But this is really useful for indicating where you want certain things to happen in your animation. Say, for example, on frame 28, you wanted a huge explosion, right? To indicate that with a marker, you would press F2 while you're moused over it, and while that marker is your active selection, it's very important that it's both your active selection and that you're mousing over it. Now I'll rename this marker Explosion, then press Enter. Is that how you spell explosion? E-X-P-L-O-S-I-O-N. We're gonna say it's how you spell explosion. Then I'm gonna move this marker to frame 28 by pressing G, then moving my mouse like so. Then I'm going to press left click to confirm that movement. So this is really useful for indicating where you want certain things to happen in your animation. You can also duplicate markers by pressing Shift+D. Again, you have to make absolutely sure that both the marker is your active selection and that your mouse is in this bottom section of your timeline right here. Otherwise, that duplication just won't work. And just like you're moving an object or a keyframe, you can press left click to confirm that movement. I'm going to delete this marker by pressing X. And again, that only works if this marker is your active selection and your mouse is down here. So I'm going to press X, delete markers, and I'll click on this marker as well, press X, delete markers. So let's briefly talk about sync options on the timeline as well, because this is extremely important. Because by default, Blender uses an option called Play Every Frame for animation playback. And you can view these sync options by clicking on this Playback tab on the timeline, and it's at the very top here under Sync. Play Every Frame, Blender's default for animation playback, is really good for heavy or laggy scenes where you want to see every frame played back to make sure you're not missing any details at all. But this option is really poor for timing purposes because the playback speed in the 3D viewport is often going to be slower than what your animation is going to look like rendered out, which is a really big problem. Because of this, I personally almost always use the sync to audio playback option, like so. Not only is sync to audio great for animations that need to be synced to music or dialogue, such as music videos or lip sync on characters, but it also keeps your playback speed consistent with what your output render will be played back at. Though this does have the downside that Blender might drop frames in order to hit the correct speed, kind of like modern video games do. Another really useful option under playback here is scrubbing under audio. If you enable that and have audio in your Blender scene, that just means that as you're holding left click on your timeline here, you're actually going to hear the audio as you're scrubbing through it, which is extremely helpful when you're animating lip sync, so you can get like proper mouth shapes like a U shape or an ah shape. Very, very handy to have that option enabled when you're animating lip sync or when you're animating to music for that matter. And finally, the last thing that's extremely important and also very controversial that I would like to cover is frame rate. That's under the scene tab, or excuse me, that's under the output properties tab all the way on the right here. You can change your frame rate right here, and there's a ton of options. Honestly, the only ones I've ever used and probably ever need to care about are 24 and 30. You can basically ignore the rest of these as far as I'm concerned, unless you're doing something very specific. Frame rate dictates how many frames your animation has in it per second. By default, Blender uses 24 FPS, which means that if we press spacebar here, every single second this animation plays back, 24 frames are happening on our screen. If we use 30 FPS, 30 frames or potentially 30 keyframes could be in every single frame. I would personally recommend that you use 24 FPS as you're starting out and if you're making animations that have motion blur in them. Because provided you have motion blur, 24 FPS does look smooth and very clean. However, if you're not using motion blur, 24 FPS can look incredibly choppy and even eye straining. So only use 24 FPS if you're going to be using motion blur. If you are not going to be using motion blur, or if you're making an animation for a video game, use 30 FPS. That is my oversimplified explanation of which frame rate you should be using. I'm sure there's going to be people angry at me in the comments, but oh well. And that about covers it. In the next video, we're going to talk about the Dopesheet, which is excellent for changing the timing of your animations, and a lot more. So be sure to check out my Patreon to get access to an exclusive Discord community and a lot more. and I'll see you in the next one. The Dopesheet is kind of like the timeline on crack. It's also a motion editor and also a keyframe manipulation tool like the timeline. However, it allows for much more granular control and information about your keyframes. And it's particularly great at changing the timing of your animations. You can make an entire polished animation using just the Dopesheet. So let's talk about it. We are once again in the default Blender scene for this tutorial. If you don't know how to get there, just press Ctrl+N for new and then click on General right here. There's many ways you can access the Dopesheet in Blender, and the fastest would actually be to click this little animation workspace at the top of the Blender window, like so. This has the Dopesheet right here, the timeline right here, and 2 3D viewports right here and here, which is just like a really nice setup to have for making animations in Blender. So if you want to quickly get into animating in Blender, this workspace is a great option to have. You can also access the Dopesheet by changing the contents of any panel of your scene to the Dopesheet. For example, I can click on this 3D viewport, click on Dopesheet, and now our 3D viewport here is the Dopesheet. But of course, we don't really want that, so we're gonna go back to here and go to 3D viewport, like so. So just like on the timeline, if we press I for insert, then we click on location, rotation, and scale on our cube, you'll see that a keyframe is placed in our Dopesheet. And if we go to frame 50 here, like so, then we press insert to insert another keyframe, and we'll do another location, rotation, and scale in this case. You can see that keyframes work the exact same way in the Dopesheet as they do in the timeline. And I'm actually gonna move our cube forward here by pressing G, and then I'm gonna confirm that placement by pressing left click. I'm gonna rotate our cube pressing R, then I'm gonna scale our cube pressing S. I just realized my screencast keys are not working. Come on, there we go. And then I'm gonna confirm all that by pressing I once again and pressing location, rotation, and scale because I don't actually have auto key on right here. I'm gonna enable that just for the hell of it. And I actually want my animation to end in frame 50 here. So all I need to do that is with my mouse in the Dopesheet, I can press P, then I can do a box selection holding left click that starts on frame 1 and ends on frame 50, just exactly where we placed our keyframes. So if I release that and then press space to play back our animation, ooh, that's a lot of rotation. But yeah, it's playing back exactly as we'd want it to, where it's ending on that final keyframe now. So if I actually turn this off by disabling the preview range, like so, you can see that it would just keep going, and there'd be a lot of dead space at the end of it, which we don't want. So we're gonna click that once more to enable that. And I'm gonna pause my animation by pressing spacebar. So just like the timeline, the Dopesheet displays keyframes and shows objects' animatable properties right next to the object name on the left side here. To expand our view here, there's this little arrow icon that we can click, and that will expand our view of all the keyframes we just placed. So remember, we pressed I to insert location, rotation, and scale, right? So if we actually look in the Dopesheet here, we can see all of our location keyframes, all of our rotation keyframes, and we can't actually see all of our scale keyframes, but we can just mouse down with our mouse. So long as we're in this part of the Dopesheet, we can mouse down to see the remainder of the scale keyframes that we just placed. To modify any of these keyframes, all you need to do is click on one. For example, we'll do the Y location, press G, then move it around. And as you can see, we are now modifying just the Y location on our cube here. And if I press right click, I will cancel that. And if I press G and then left click, I will confirm it, just like the timeline. Again, please watch the last video if you've not seen it yet, because it explains a lot of this in depth. I'm gonna undo that by pressing Ctrl+Z, and now let's say I actually wanna select all these keyframes in this row, right? I wanna change the timing of all of them at the same time. Well, to do that, there's actually a section on our timeline here, or excuse me, our Dopesheet here called Summary, which lets us do that, but we can't actually see it right now. And that's because it's at the top of our Dopesheet, and it can be really annoying because it's kind of hard to tell that this isn't actually the top of the Dopesheet, and we're not seeing everything here. And there's a few ways to fix that. One is to scroll up using this little scroll wheel at the top, and we can see right now that the summary is right there. You can also use middle mouse button to scroll around on your Dopesheet, or you can press the home button, which is the button on your keyboard above the arrow key, so the home button. That kind of frames all of your keyframes in the Dopesheet in a really nice way. So now if I click on this keyframe in the summary section and press G, we're gonna be changing all of our keyframes at the same time in this row. So I'm going to undo that placement that I just did by pressing Ctrl+C, which was on the exact same keyframe, so I don't know why I did that. But you can also do the exact same thing by holding Alt and then left-clicking anywhere on this row of keyframes. So if you want to select an entire row of keyframes at the exact same time, press Alt, then left-click in the Dopesheet. And now if I press G here, we're moving around like so. I'll confirm that placement by pressing left mouse on frame 0. And again, just like the timeline, you can manipulate keyframes in the Dopesheet the exact same way. So I'm grabbing keyframes with left mouse button here. I'm moving keyframes with G. I'm confirming placements with left mouse button. I'm undoing placements with Ctrl+Z. And you can also copy and paste keyframes. So if I have this, say for example, I wanted to copy and paste this final keyframe we made on frame 50, I will press left mouse button to highlight it. Then I will press I'll press Ctrl+C to copy it. And then if I wanted this on frame 20, for example, I will move my playhead to frame 20 and then press Ctrl+V, which is paste. So Ctrl+C is copy and Ctrl+V is paste. So now if we play back our animation, it gets to that final frame really quickly. So I'm going to press pause once more and undo that by pressing Ctrl+C. You might have also noticed that in the Dopesheet, there's this series of checkboxes. And if we play back our animation and click this checkbox, you'll see that it actually stops because this checkbox essentially disables animation either on an entire object or an animation channel. So if I uncheck all the rotation keyframes, for example, you'll see that our cube is no longer rotating because that just disables all the animation in those channels, which can be really handy sometimes. I'll enable all those by clicking on the checkbox on them once again. And this little lock icon kind of does exactly what you'd expect it to do. If I click on this lock and then try to move my keyframes, Blender doesn't let me. So the lock icon just either locks an entire object or a specific animation channel so you can't like mess with it accidentally for whatever reason. I'll unlock that again by clicking on the lock icon. One of the most exciting parts of the Dopesheet that I swear to God I didn't even know was a thing until like yesterday when I was doing research for this video, it's under View. So if we click on View and go to Show Sliders, it's right there, Show Sliders, very important. If we click on that, you will see that, it's kind of hard to see what we're looking at here because things are getting overlapped. So I'm gonna hold left mouse button when my mouse turns into that like arrow icon shape, and I'll hold left mouse and drag it out so this whole section's a little bit bigger and easier to read. And by enabling that option, we can now see in real time all of the values on every single animation channel we have right here. But say on frame 25, and I'm gonna pause our animation by pressing space. Say in frame 25, we want our cube to like jump. So I don't know why you'd want that, but let's, for the sake of argument, let's do that. So we're gonna go to Y location? No, Z location. And then we're just gonna hold left mouse button on that and drag our mouse to the right. Now if we play back our animation, you can see that our cube does a little bounce like that. And that's so amazingly useful because it means that you can do all the animating you'd ever need to do on an animation just in this single panel. Because normally you'd have to go like here, which is like the object data properties, right? Yeah, object properties. You'd have to go to this panel, which is really annoying and like far away. But this way you can do absolutely everything in like the exact same place, which is just an amazing, amazing time save. So I highly recommend you check that option out. There's also this little option right here at the top of the Dopesheet called Only Show Selected. So if I deselect my cube by just left clicking in any of this negative space in our 3D viewport, then I click on this option, you can now see that we will see all the animation channels of our cube, even though it is not an actively selected object in our viewport. So if I click on this again, you'll see that the cube disappears and will only reappear if I click on it and it's my active selection. There's also a handy option next to this called Show Hidden, which essentially views channels and objects that are hidden in your scene. So if you had another cube here, for example, and it was hidden, you would be able to see its animation channels if it was selected, or if you had Only Show Selected turned off. You can also make channel groups in the Dopesheet. So if I click on X location, for example, on my cube here, then I shift click Y location in Z location, then pressed Ctrl+G, and then I can name this group, for example, location, because it's just the location keyframes on my object. Then press enter. You'll now see that right here we have a location group on our cube. So we can expand this just like we expanded our object transforms right here. We can expand this by pressing this little arrow icon, then scroll down. We'll see all of our location channels right here, which can be nice because you can press B then box select all of those. And it can just be a nice way to like quickly organize and select things in the dope sheet. And say, for example, you want to access the summary section at the top of the dope sheet or just get a bird's eye view of everything going on in your dope sheet, you can press the home button on your keyboard to view everything at once. And something really neat that is so useful, and I only discovered this recently, I wish I had known it sooner, is that you can press Control plus Tab to instantly switch to this editor, which is the graph editor. This is what we're going to talk about in the next video, and it's crucial for when you're at the polishing stages of your animation and you really want to refine things and take things to the next level visually in your animations. So be sure to check out that video right after this one, and check out my Patreon to get access to an exclusive Discord community and a heck of a lot more. I'll see you in the next one. The graph editor is the last motion editor we're going to be covering in this series, and is probably the most powerful motion editor in Blender. It can seem really intimidating at first, but trust me, once you understand the fundamentals of using it, it becomes very simple, and we're about to cover those right now. And to be honest with you guys, as I was doing research for this video, I learned so much stuff about using the graph editor that I had no idea that you could do. So whether you've never touched the graph editor in your life, or you've been using it for years like me, you're gonna learn something valuable from this video. These tutorials take hours of script writing and preparation before I even press the record button, so please like this video and subscribe if you find it helpful. But without further ado, let's jump into it. To access the graph editor in Blender, all you need to do is mouse on over to the top of Blender right here and click on this animation workspace. However, when you do that, you might actually notice there isn't a graph editor here. This is the dope sheet, not the graph editor. But as we covered in the last video, all we need to do to change that is mouse on over our dope sheet and press Control plus Tab. That switches our dope sheet to the graph editor. Then after that, I'm gonna insert a location, rotation, and scale keyframe in the 3D viewport by pressing I and then clicking location, rotation, and scale. And I'm going to turn on my screencast keys. There, now you can see the hotkeys I press. Awesome. Okay, so after that, I'm gonna mouse on over to frame 50 here using my playhead in the graph editor. And I'm actually gonna turn on auto key so I don't have to place this keyframe manually. It's gonna automatically place a keyframe when I move my object. So then I'm gonna press G, then Y. So G moves an object and pressing Y locks the movement of that object to the Y axis. Then I'm gonna confirm my movement by pressing left mouse like so. Now, we can already see some movement in our graph editor, which is awesome, but we actually can't see it very well. To fix that though, all we need to do is press numpad period on our keyboard, which is right next to enter on your numpad. That frames our selected keyframes in the graph editor, which in our case here is all the keyframes we have. And it's interesting to note that doing that in the 3D viewport does the exact same thing. So if I press numpad 0, it's going to frame our selected object in the 3D viewport, which in our case here is our cube. So if I zoom out here, you can see that we've framed our selected object, which is our cube. And in the graph editor, we framed our selected keys. And I want my animation to stop on frame 50 in this case, because if I hit play here, it's gonna be a bunch of dead space that I don't want. So I'm gonna press pause, then press P to set our preview range. Then I'm gonna hold left mouse button after mousing over frame 50, drag this box over to frame 1, then release. Now, if I hit play, our animation starts on frame 1 and ends on frame 50, like so. So just like with the dope sheet, to access our animation channels, we have to expand this little box right here by clicking this arrow. Now, by doing that, we can see all of our location keyframes, all of our rotation keyframes, and all of our scale keyframes. To select all the keyframes in any of these channels, all you need to do is double click on them. And in our case here, we only care about the Y location keyframes because those are the only keyframes with animation data on them. So I'm gonna double click on my Y location keyframes to select all of them. So moving keyframes in the graph editor is exactly the same as moving keyframes in the dope sheet and moving keyframes in the timeline. If I press R, we start to rotate our keyframes like so. If I press S, we start to scale our keyframes. And if I press G, we start to move our keyframes. I'm going to cancel that by pressing right click. However, what differs from the timeline in the dope sheet is we're not locked to just changing the timing of our keyframes. We can also change the value of our keyframes. So if I press G to move our keyframes and then press Y to lock our movement to the Y axis, just like we locked our movement in the 3D viewport, then I start moving my mouse, you can see that we're changing the value of our keyframes, not the timing, which is really cool. If we just wanted to change the timing of our keyframes, we could press X, which would lock our movement of our keyframes to the X axis. And now you can see we're not changing the value of our keyframes, we're just changing the timing. That is what makes the graph editor so incredibly powerful and what sets it apart from the dope sheet and the timeline. The dope sheet and timeline are great for changing timing, but the graph editor is amazing because you can not only change the timing of your animations, but you can also easily change the values of your animations, which is awesome. I'm going to cancel this movement by pressing right click. And just like with the dope sheet, if we alt click on a keyframe, that selects all keyframes that are in that row. So we've now selected every single keyframe we placed at the beginning of this animation. So if I press G here, then start moving things around, you're going to notice some really weird stuff happening in our 3D viewport. That's because we're not only changing the timing of our animation here, but we're also changing the value of our scale keyframes, our rotation keyframes, and our location keyframes. Though with our rotation keyframes, the movement is really subtle, so it's a little harder to see that. And again, if we just want to change the timing of all of these keyframes, we press X to lock it to the X axis, so we're only changing the timing of all of our keyframes. And if I just want to change the value of all of these keyframes, I can press Y, so we're only changing the value of our keyframes. And now you can see if I move my mouse up and down, this cube gets really big and really small. I'm going to cancel this movement by pressing right click. And to select all of our keyframes, just like the timeline and just like the dope sheet, all we need to do is press A on our keyboard for all. Now if I press G, we're changing the value and timing of all keyframes in our scene. So I'm going to press right click to cancel that. But say you want to change the timing of our animation overall by using scale, like we did in the timeline and the dope sheet. We're going to pause our animation and go to frame 1 and try to do that. So if I press S to scale, then move my mouse around, you're going to notice one problem immediately. And that problem is that we are not scaling the timing of our animation. We're scaling both the timing of our animation and the values of our animation. So if we just want to change the speed of our animation to make it like overall longer or overall slower, this is not the way to do it. To fix that, again, we just press X. So now, because I pressed X and I'm locking my scale to the X axis, you can see that we're just changing the timing of our animation. So if I move my mouse up, it becomes longer. And if I move my mouse down, it becomes shorter overall. However, this is a really bad way of scaling timing because we're actually scaling from the center, which is really confusing and hard to adjust. So to fix that, I'm actually going to press right click to cancel that. Then I'm going to go to the top right of our 3D viewport. I'm going to go to the top right of our graph editor, then click on pivot point because by default, it's using bounding box center, which is not ideal for this kind of scaling. I want to select 2D cursor, which will actually make it so that we scale from our playhead in our graph editor. Now, if I press S to scale, then X to lock to the X axis to make sure I'm not scaling our values and I'm just scaling our timing, we are now making our animation shorter overall or longer overall from that specific point in space. To make it a little bit more obvious what this is doing, if I go to frame 50, do the exact same thing, press S, then X, you can see that we are now scaling from frame 50, which is a lot more of an intuitive way to change the timing of our animation overall. So I'm going to cancel that by pressing right click. I'm going to go back up here and switch this back to bounding box center. And right next to this, you might have noticed that this only show selected option is also available in the timeline. So if I deselect my cube by selecting this negative space in the 3D viewport, you can now see that we don't see any of our animation channels. But if I turn this off, we can see them all once again because this option lets us see all animation channels in our scene, whether or not the object is selected. But personally, I almost always have that on, so I'm going to select our cube once again. However, you might have noticed that when you select a keyframe in the graph editor, there are these handles that come off of the edges of your keyframes. These handles are what determine how the computer goes from one keyframe into another. So if we have a nice gradual transition on the Y location, as we do here, and play back our animation, you can see that just like we're seeing in the graph editor here, our cube is kind of starting real smoothly, it gets a little bit faster in the middle, and stops very slowly. So there's a nice slow in and slow out of this movement. However, if we left click on this keyframe right here, then hold left click on our handle here, just drag that over to the right, this movement becomes really snappy and fast. So you can see that our cube is like really like jolting on to the right a little bit faster. And we can compare that to the original by doing this. So this is what this looks like originally. And if we undo that, this is what it looks like after a movement. So this is before, and this is after. So as you can see, it's becoming a lot faster and zippier. You can modify handles in Blender the exact same way you modify keyframes. So if I mouse over our graph editor here and press G, we can move our handle like so. If I press S, we can scale our handle like so. And if I press R, we can rotate our handle like so. And I'm going to confirm that by pressing left click. But say you want to reset your handle so that it's back to how it originally was. All you need to do is click on your keyframe, then press Shift plus S on your keyboard, then press this option right here called Flatten Handles. Now, as you can see, our handles are back to the original orientation they were at. But you can also change handle types in Blender. But before we do that, I'm going to pause my animation and go to frame 25 and show you something that's really, really handy. So making sure that I have the Y location selected, then press I for Insert Keyframe, you're going to see this really awesome option right here called Only Selected Channels. This option means that only your selected channels are going to get a new keyframe when you insert it. So if I click this option and go over to my Z location, you're going to see that there's no new keyframe there, or any of my other channels. It is only inserted a keyframe on my Y location, which is really useful when you don't want to place a bunch of unnecessary keyframes. Now I'm going to click on my keyframe I placed on frame 25, then I'm going to press V here to open our Set Keyframe Handle Type menu. And by default, Blender is using this option right here called Aligned. Just like we saw earlier, if we click on a handle and then move it with this option enabled, the other opposite handle kind of follows the orientation of that handle. So it's aligned with the other position of the handle. However, if I press right click to cancel that, click on our keyframe again, then press V and go to Free Handle Type, that means our handles are now unlocked from one another. So I can click on this handle here, press G, do some crazy movement like this, and now our other handle is not following this one. So I can click on our, oops, I actually clicked off of our keyframe there by mistake. So I'm going to click on our keyframe once again to make it visible. And I can't even see my other keyframe because my computer is really terrible monitor, but right here, I've eventually found my other handle. So I'm going to press G to move it. And then as you can see here, I can also move this handle independent of the other one. So I'm going to confirm that movement by pressing left click. And now when I play back my animation, we're going to get something really weird. But this is really useful for things like bouncing ball animations where you want something to like, hit against the ground and go boop, 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 like that. That's the kind of thing that free handle types are really, really useful for. I'm going to pause my animation by pressing space though. The final handle type I wanted to discuss is automatic. So I'm going to box select my keyframe right here, then press V and click automatic. And the best way I can describe automatic is that it's Blender trying to get the smoothest possible transitions from one key to another automatically. And sometimes it kind of messes this up and overshoots things a little bit too much, but this option is really, really helpful for things like character hair or character accessories, where you really want like a smooth movement quickly. So I would highly recommend you mess with this handle type. It's very, very useful. Something else I wanted to show you very briefly is if we go back to the dope sheet by pressing Control plus Tab, you can see that our keyframe actually looks different here in the center. So I'm going to zoom in and then use middle mouse button to zoom on over like so. This keyframe looks different because we've changed the handle type to be automatic. So if we pressed V here and went to vector, for example, our keyframe now looks like a box. And if we press V here and go back to aligned, which is the default, it kind of gets that original default keyframe shape, which is just a nice little visualization of what you're doing in the graph editor or the dope sheet. So I'm I'm going to switch back to the graph editor using Control plus Tab. But now let's briefly talk about keyframe visibility. So by default, if I zoom out here and do a big box selection, we're going to select every single keyframe on our cube, which can be really annoying when you're just trying to modify one channel, but you could keep on accidentally selecting the other ones. However, there's actually a way to fix this, which is really cool. So I'm going to left click on my Y location channel right here. Then I'm going to go to View in my graph editor and mouse on over to only selected curve keyframes. So if I click on this option and then I do a box selection like I just did, now I'm only going to be selecting the Y location channel, which is really handy when you're switching between channels. You don't want to be accidentally selecting a different channel. And again, if we want to expand our view, we can press numpad period to focus on selected, which in our case here is the Y location keyframes. But what if we wanted to hide every single animation channel except the one we have selected? So we're just viewing and focusing on that channel in particular. That's actually extremely easy. With our channel highlighted like it is here, all you need to do is press Shift plus H for hide. What that does is hide every single animation channel except the one you have currently selected, which is what this little eye icon represents. So this eye icon hides and unhides channels. So if we click this on the Y location, we no longer see that. So I'm going to make that visible once again by clicking that icon. If you want to reveal all channels, however, that is Alt plus H. So Alt plus H reveals all channels and Shift plus H hides all channels except the ones you have currently selected. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is keyframe interpolation types, which let you change how the computer is interpolating between our keyframes. And that sounds a little bit complicated, but really this is very similar to what we were just doing with our handles. So I'm going to double click on our Y location to make sure it's totally selected. Then I'm going to press T on my keyboard, T as in train. By doing that, you're going to see a lot of options, but really the three we care about the most by far are constant, linear, and Bezier. By default, Blender uses Bezier as its default interpolation type. So if we play back our animation here, we're getting this really smooth, slow in, slow out action on our cube. It's default for a reason. This looks really nice and beautiful for most types of actions. However, if we press T, then switch this over to linear, you're going to see the curves in our graph editor become straight lines to one another. So our cube is now just going from each keyframe in a perfectly straight line like so, which also removes the handles on our keyframes, by the way, because they become completely redundant. This is really nice when you need a perfectly, mathematically perfectly straight movement, for example, on a camera dolly or something similar like that, and it's a really good option to have. And if I press T once again, we're going to see our final option here, which is constant. If I click on this option, you're going to see that all the interpolation the computer was just doing has completely been erased. So there's no computer interpolation between these keyframes whatsoever. This is a lot more reminiscent of 2D animation, and it's a really nice way to block in the timing and poses of an animation early on. But that about covers it. That is just about everything you need to know to start making animations using the graph editor in Blender. We're going to be closing up our coverage of the graph editor in the next video by covering animation modifiers, dynamic effects, and extrapolation modes, which are really awesome tools that let you modify your animations instantly and non-destructively in order to add visual noise, instant dynamic effects to your animations, and a lot more. If that was helpful, please like the video and subscribe to check out all the other videos on this channel, and have a great day. Animation modifiers in Blender are really awesome, and they're actually something that's not even available to us in similar animation programs like Maya. Just like mesh modifiers in Blender non-destructively modify meshes, animation modifiers in Blender non-destructively modify animation curves. They're an extremely powerful, totally non-destructive tool that let us add instant dynamic effects to our animations. This video also marks the last touching point on the graph editor, so we're going to cover the remainder of everything you need to know to quickly and proficiently animate using it. But without further ado, let's jump into it. I'm going to very quickly go to our animation workspace here, insert a keyframe by pressing I, Go over to frame 50 here. Actually, turn on auto key. Insert, location, rotation, and scale. Then I'm gonna move my cube by pressing G, Y, left click to confirm. And if I'm moving way too fast for you, please watch the previous videos where we go into everything I just did in way more depth. So I'm gonna also scale my cube, rotate my cube like so, and that's pretty good. So now I'm gonna actually wanna set my play range to frame 1 through 50. So I'm gonna press P for play range, hold left click, and drag a box selection from frame 50 to frame 1. Again, that's too fast for you. Please watch the previous videos. We go into this in a lot more depth. So yeah, now this is the Dopesheet, not the graph editor, but again, we can instantly switch to the graph editor using Control plus Tab. And I just noticed my screencast keys are not working. There we go. Awesome. So one more thing that I want to touch on before we get into modifiers here is this button right here, which is normalize. Normalize essentially normalizes the display of all of our curves in the graph editor to make them a little bit more even. So if I click this button and kind of zoom out here, you can kind of see what it's doing, where it's kind of normalizing the values of all of our keyframes in a way that can sometimes make it easier when you're editing multiple channels at once. So if I expand our cube here, click on rotation, Shift H to hide all of our channels that are not rotation. And again, I just held left click there to do a box selection, just like we did for the preview range. So if I press home to kind of frame our view here and turn normalize on and off, you're gonna see what's happening here. It really just kind of makes the previewing of multiple channels at once easier sometimes. Honestly, I kind of just click this button at random to see if it looks better or worse than what I was previously looking at when I was editing multiple curves in the graph editor. It's kind of just something you can go by vibe and be like, oh, this is kind of hard to read. Let's turn this on to see if this is any better. So if I click home here again, you can see that this is what it looks like without normalize, and this is what it looks like with normalize. It really just depends on your scene and what kind of project you're working on at any given time. So I would just play with this option to see whatever looks better and more easier to understand to you. But yeah, back to the point of the video. Let's talk about modifiers. So just like we can go into 3D viewport and press N to get this little side menu right here, we can also do that in the graph editor. So if we're moused over the graph editor and we press N, we get this little menu on the side. But to actually add a modifier here, we have to click on a channel. So now by clicking on that channel, we can now see this tab right here called modifiers. This is where we add modifiers to our animation. And for our purposes here, I'm actually gonna click on Y location, press Shift plus H to hide every animation channel except Y location, then press home on my keyboard to kind of frame our curves like so. Now I'm going to click on add modifier and we're going to see a bunch of options here. But honestly, we only care about 3 of these options, that being stepped interpolation, cycles, and noise. Let's start with stepped interpolation. Now if we press spacebar here, we're actually going to see a lot of stuff happening because we animated our cube not only moving but also rotating and scaling. So to make it a little bit more obvious what's actually happening here, I'm actually going to press the checkbox next to rotation and scale. Unchecking those boxes, we're basically disabling the animation on those channels. So if we click them again, they're going to come right back to us. But if we hold left click and turn all of those channels off, we're able to kind of instantly preview what our animation looks like without them, which is really helpful. So I'm going to play back our animation like so. And as we can see, our animation looks a little bit different now. So if we pause our animation and frame by frame through it using the left and right arrow keys on our keyboard, you're going to see something interesting happen. Our cube is only updating every other frame. This is what's called being on 2s in 2D animation, which means that you're only getting a new frame every other frame. You can control this, however, by changing the step size value on our modifier. So if we left click this and type in 3, then hit enter, now our animation is only going to be updating every 3rd frame. So if we play back our animation, it's going to look even chunkier. This is really useful for stop motion animation styles, Spider-Versian animation styles, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish animation styles. Like, this is a really amazing tool that's a Blender exclusive, because for most other animation software, you're gonna have to actually bake down your animation to get it to preview to look like this if it's already smooth and splined out. But with Blender, I can press this checkbox right here and we're instantly back to our original animation. So this change is completely non-destructive, which is really, really, really useful and one of the coolest parts of animating in Blender. But there's more really useful options directly below this, that being start frame and end frame. If we click on end frame, that will actually set our end frame to 0, which basically turns off our animation. But for example, if I set my end frame to 25 here, as we can see in our graph editor and the 3D viewport by just looking at the animation, our animation becomes really smooth after frame 25. That's because the modifier is completely turning off after frame 25, because that's what we've set our end frame for this modifier to be. We can also change the start frame on our modifier to, let's say, just drag it up to frame 10. Now we can see that our animation starts smooth, gets real blocky, and gets smooth again. And there's even an influence slider, which is awesome. This is basically like, if you've ever used Clip Studio Paint or Photoshop or any program like that, this is basically an opacity slider. So if I drag this up and down, we can look at the curves in our graph editor here to see that it's basically just changing the overall influence of our modifier in general, which is so awesome and really, really useful. And there's even one more really useful thing under this restrict frame range button. So if we click this, we actually expand it. Then by enabling it, there's these two super useful options right here called blend in and blend out. And I'm actually going to make my start frame a little later in the animation to make this a little clearer what's actually happening here. By dragging up the value of our blend in here, we're actually smoothly transitioning into this modifier. And by dragging this blend out, we're smoothly transitioning into the end of our modifier, that being the start frame and the end frame that we just set previously. And again, this is the stepped animation modifier, but all of these options also apply to every other animation modifier in Blender. So you can do this with a noise modifier, and I believe you can even do this with a cycles modifier. So really, really powerful stuff. But speaking of a noise modifier, let's check that out. So to disable this modifier, I can press this checkbox to just disable it. So basically the modifier is still there, but we don't see what it's doing and it's not gonna like show up in our animation. But if we wanna just completely remove a modifier in Blender, you actually press this checkbox right here. So that just totally removes the modifier. Now let's click on add modifier and go to noise. So if we click on noise, we're gonna see that the movement of our cube becomes really stuttery and blocky. This is a super powerful modifier if you want to do something like camera shake, or maybe you have like a first person reload animation where you kind of like want the hands to have like a natural like jitter to them that makes your animation feel a little bit more gritty and realistic. This modifier is the way to go, and it's super useful for that kind of stuff. There's also a bunch of settings with it. For example, the scale kind of just changes the overall scale of the noise. So this is like really fine-grained noise right here. But if we drag that up, it becomes a little bit more smooth and subtle. The strength changes like how the influence or how strong overall the noise is. So if we drag this up, it gets really wild and crazy, as you can see there. If we drag this down, it becomes a lot more subtle of a jitter. You can also change this offset here, which kind of smoothly changes the offset of your noise. And you can also do phase here, which just changes the overall phase of your noise. These are a little bit more niche and less useful than scale and strength. You're probably just going to be messing with scale and strength the most, honestly. And again, just like every other value in Blender, you can press backspace while you're moused over it to reset it to the default value. There's also depth here, but honestly, I'm not entirely sure what's happening here and it's not super useful. So I just usually leave that at default. And again, we have an influence slider right here, so we can drag that up and down to change the overall opacity of our noise, if you want to call it that. And just like with stepped animation, we can restrict the frame range. So let's say that it'll start on frame 4 and stop on frame 40. Now we can see we got a little bit of jitter starting on frame 4 and it completely stops on frame 40. But say we wanted to smoothly transition in and out of this jitter, that's no problem. You can just drag this blend in, just slowly, smoothly transition into the noise, and you can use this blend out to slowly transition out of the noise. So maybe you have like a car and it's going over like rough gravel, but then it goes onto a smooth road. That's the kind of use for this modifier. But let's X out of this modifier and talk about the last modifier I wanted to touch on today, which is cycles. So this is gonna look a little weird if we just click on that because we're already looping our animation. But let's stop looping our animation and see what happens without this modifier. So I'm gonna click on this button right here to turn off our preview range. I'm gonna press home to kind of frame our curves here. Then I want to play back our animation and we're going to see what happens when we just play back our animation right now. So normally when we play back our animation, it goes from frame 0 to frame 50, starts and stops slowly, and then it ends. But by enabling cycles, this makes our animation loop. So the moment we hit frame 50, it instantly teleports back to the keyframe on frame 0, and it has a perfectly looping animation. So for something like this, it's a little bit weird to look at. The curves look super odd. So let's actually make our animation loop by just left clicking on our first keyframe here, going to frame 55, then Control V to paste. So all I did there was left click on this first keyframe, press Control plus V, then I press Control plus C to paste that keyframe. Now I'm going to press A to select all my keyframes, then I press V to go to automatic. So we'll have like a really smooth motion here just for fun. We don't need to do that. Then I'm going to go to frame 1. We're going to see what's happening here. We have a perfectly infinitely looping animation that goes on like forever. We can keep scrolling forward here to frame like 2000 plus, and it's still going to be happening in that point in the future. Now this might look really weird, but this is an extremely, extremely useful modifier in Blender. Every time you want to do something like a walk or a character run, or a character just, just like breathing in space, being neutral, this is the modifier you want to use. For any type of looping animation, this is an invaluable, invaluable modifier. In fact, this modifier is so useful, there's actually another hotkey shortcut to access it. So if I select all of my keyframes here by pressing A, then I press Shift plus E, there's two options right here, Make Cyclic and Clear Cyclic. This is just a faster way of doing what we just did. So if I hit Clear Cyclic on this modifier and click on our Y location again, the modifier is no longer there. And if I press Shift plus E and do Make Cyclic, you're going to see our modifier come right back once again. And just like with keyframes, you can copy and paste modifiers as well. So if I pause my animation and press this button right here called Copy F Modifiers, that's going to copy every single modifier I have on this animation channel. So if I press Alt plus H here and then re-enable these animation channels by holding left click and getting all these checked once more, then I pressed A to select all of my animation channels, then I pressed Paste right here. So this is how you copy animation modifiers and this is how you paste them. Now when we play back our animation, every single channel is looping because we have that cycles modifier on every channel. So if we click on Z location, it's got cycles. If we click on X rotation, it's got cycles because we selected all of them and pasted that cycles modifier onto them. But again, you can do the exact same thing by pressing A to select all of your channels, then going Shift plus E, Make Cyclic. But we can also remove all those cycling modifiers by pressing Clear Cyclic after we do Shift plus E. So now if we do that, we have no cycling, and if we do it again, Shift plus E, Make Cyclic, we are cycling once again. I'm going to undo that by pressing Control plus Z though. And there's actually a shortcut to do all of this. So if we double click on Y location, for example, and then do Control Shift M, this brings up the Add F Curve Modifier menu, which is the exact same thing as this menu on the right. It's just a faster way of doing it via a hotkey. So if I had our, let's say, stepped interpolation modifier here, it just makes a modifier on this channel specifically because that's what we had selected. Just a little bit of a faster way of doing what we just did. And again, because this is just a modifier and we're non-destructively editing our animation, we can change our animation and the modifier will essentially follow the curve non-destructively. So if I click on this last frame here and then press G, then X, and move this way forward so our animation's a lot slower, and then go to frame 1 to play this back, our modifier has just adjusted in real time to compensate. So if we look at our curves here, then press G and X, you're going to see that no matter how much we move our curves or modify this animation, our modifier is going to adjust in real time to compensate because it's a non-destructive modifier on top of existing animation that you splined out. So that is why this is so exciting and powerful of a feature in Blender. The last thing I wanted to briefly touch on are dynamic effects. So to do that, I'm going to click on my Y location here. Then I'm going to press Shift plus H and get rid of this stepped modifier and zoom out a bit. Then I'm going to press A to select all of my curves and press T. So T is where we actually changed our interpolation modes in the last video. So that's where you change from constant to linear to Bezier. But I wanted to briefly touch on dynamic effects, which are these three on the right here, which are back, bounce, and elastic. Personally, I do not use these, but they're really cool and a really fast way of instantly getting a, unsurprisingly, dynamic effect onto your animations. So for example, if I go to this elastic option and then play back my animation, my cube essentially bounces back and forth and has this like springy buoyancy effect every time it gets to a new point in space. And if I press T here once again and do bounce, this is actually going to move like a bouncing ball. So if I go to frame 0, it's going to like hit against an object and bounce next to it in a really perfectly like mathematically correct way. So if you really quickly need something to bounce against an object, like a ball or whatever it might be, this is a really fast way of doing it. But that wraps up the graph editor. That is basically everything you need to know about using the graph editor in Blender. And in the next video, we're finally going to talk about importing and animating our own characters in Blender, which is really, really exciting. So be sure to be subscribed so you don't miss that video. And check out my Patreon if you want to get access to our exclusive Discord community and a whole lot more. So thank you for watching. Let's get to the fun part, finally. Importing and animating characters in Blender. Let's talk about it. Now, there are many different resources and websites that you can use to download animation-ready characters in Blender. However, if we go to the Blender Studio website, which will be linked in the description, and we go to this Characters tab right here, you're going to see that they have every character that they've made and used in their shorts available to download completely for free, which that's amazing on its own. But if we scroll down here, again, this is on the Blender Studio website, link in the description, you're going to find this character rig right here, which is the Rain rig. So if we click on this like so, we're going to see that Rain is a generic character rig designed for practicing and learning animation in Blender. So whether you've never animated in Blender before in your life, or if you want to brush up on your animation skills, this rig is really, really good and excellent for that. So we're going to use this rig to start out with, and there's a download button right at the bottom right here that you can click on to download this rig for free. So I'm going to click that right now. Then I'm going to drag this to the side, and right now we have our Blender scene like here, but we actually need to extract this file because it's a zip right now in order to use it. So what I like to do is go to my Documents folder, then right-click and do New Folder. And personally, I like to make a Blender folder in my Documents folder. Then I like to enter that folder, then right-click once again and do New Folder, then call this folder Characters. So in our Documents, we create a Blender folder, and then in that Blender folder, we create a Characters folder. So I'm going to double-click on this folder like so. Then I'm going to drag and drop that file we just downloaded, which is actually in my Downloads folder. So I'm going to drag and drop that zip right here into this folder. Now, because I'm on Windows 11, I'm going to right-click on this file and click Extract All. Then hit Extract, and a few seconds later, we're going to have our rig ready to go, which is awesome. I'm going to delete this zip file right now. So I'm going to click on that, press delete on my keyboard because we don't need the zip anymore. This is what we need. So I'm going to double click on that. And right here, we have the rain_rig.blend. That's what we need to use this rig. Now there's a few different ways to open this. You can double click on this, which will just open Blender in a new window and open that file. But personally, I usually just drag this into my Blender window. So I hold left click, drag it over my Blender window like so, then release left click and hit open. And now you're going to see this little pop-up box right here, which says, for security reasons, automatic execution of Python scripts in this file was disabled. Of course, we can trust this file because it's from the Blender Studio website. And honestly, whenever I'm starting a new Blender installation, I always check permanently allow execution of scripts and then do allow execution, which just basically means that this box is never going to appear again, because if you don't do that, every single time you open a scene with a script in it, it's going to ask you this, which is really, really annoying, because basically every character rig you're going to be using in Blender is going to have a Python script, because these scripts let you switch between animation controllers and different parts of your armature a lot faster, and they're really useful to have. So you always want to be executing these. Just, of course, be smart. Don't download some shady rig. But for our purposes here, I am going to permanently allow execution of scripts and click Allow Execution, which just enabled this little Cloud Rig tab right here. So if we press N in our 3D viewport, you might remember that that opens this little dialog box right here. And what that script just did is gave us all these layers that we can switch between. So these are called our IK layers, which means inverse kinematics. So we have IK right here and IK secondary, but we also have forward kinematics, which is short for FK. We have FK primary and secondary here, like so. We also have controls for the fingers, controls for the hair, controls for the clothes, controls for the face extras, controls for the face tweak bones, for the stretch bones. We have a lot of controls here, and when you're animating, you want as little of these controls visible as you need. So in our case here, I'm just going to click on these. Just make sure that the IK, FK, and hair controllers are visible. And again, this is only visible because of that script that we allowed the execution of this little like really neat menu. So again, I'd highly recommend you allow execution of that script. But that's it. You are now ready to animate. You've learned everything you need to know to animate up to this point if you've watched all the videos before this one. So this is a cakewalk from here on out. All you need to do is click on your armature, which is basically the set of controllers on top of your model that manipulate your model. So you can kind of think of your armature as like strings on a puppet, or maybe the joints on an action figure. So by selecting your armature, which you can tell it's selected by the fact that it's orange, we can go to the top left of our viewport and change our viewport's mode. So we haven't really talked about modes yet, but basically by default, Blender is in object mode. And object mode is really, really good for moving and manipulating and animating objects, as you might expect. There's also edit mode here, which is great for modeling. And there's also pose mode. So pose mode, you can think of as animation mode, really. Edit mode, you can kind of think of as modeling mode, and object mode, you can just think of as object mode. These modes are designed to make your life a lot easier and a lot faster when you're just trying to do one specific task in Blender. So if you're just modeling, you want to be using edit mode, and if you're just animating, you just want to be using pose mode. But you can only switch to pose mode when you actually have an armature selected or nothing selected. So if I press Alt-A to deselect all, I can still enter pose mode. But if I select a model, like her t-shirt model, for example, then I go to the top left of my viewport, you're going to see that there's not an option to enter pose mode. So that's really important to keep in mind. So if you don't have the ability to enter pose mode in your scene, make sure your armature is selected or you have nothing selected. But personally, I would just make sure your armature is selected. Personally though, I always enter pose mode by pressing Control plus Tab. That is the fastest way to switch between pose mode and object mode, is just by pressing Control plus Tab on your keyboard like so. Which you might remember is the exact same hotkey to switch between the Dopesheet and the graph editor. So just like you can switch between the graph editor and Dopesheet by pressing Control plus Tab, you can also switch between object mode and pose mode in the 3D viewport by pressing that exact same hotkey, Control plus Tab. But that's all you need to get going. You put in a lot of work to get to this point, so have fun with this. Put her into a funny pose. You can even do an animation if you want to. So I can press A to select all of our controllers here, press I, do location, rotation, and scale. I could switch this on over to the timeline and turn on auto keys, so I don't have to insert a keyframe every time I move her. And yeah, we can put her into any pose we want. We can select her pelvis bone here, and we can see the name of the bones at the top left of our 3D viewport here. We can move her around like this. We can select her arms. Again, I'm just moving G, pressing G to move her like so, pressing R to rotate these bones. This is exactly the same as what we've been doing up to this point. Now we're just doing it on an armature for a character. So the process is exactly the same. If I wanted to scale this, I can press S, and now we're scaling it. If I want to cancel that, I can press right click. This is exactly what we've been doing, but it's a little bit more fun now because we're now doing this on a character, not a cube. So yeah, I'm gonna recommend that everyone watching this video, go put her into a funny pose, have fun with this, maybe even do an animation, make her dab, make her do a jump, make her do whatever you want. Just have fun with this. And remember everything you learned up to this point, like how you can press G to move something, then you can press X to lock it to an axis if you want to just move her foot back, for example. Just figure out what these controllers do and have fun with them, because in the next video, we're going to talk about the difference between IK and FK in a lot more depth, and the purpose of all these controls and how to switch between them best. So make sure to join the Crashsune Patreon to get access to an exclusive Discord community and to help ensure that I can keep making tutorials like this one for free. And thank you so much for watching. Let's talk about the difference between IK and FK and rig layers. And you can get this banging shirt and support this channel by going to patreon.com/Crashsune. Wink, wink. Anyway, in the last video, we figured out how to pose our character and the basics of animating them. And in order to speed up this process, I'm actually going to click the top of my Blender window here and go to the Animation tab. That will just allow me quick access to the dope sheet as well as the timeline, where I can turn on automatic keying because I hate having automatic keying off personally. It's really annoying. So I'm going to zoom in, go right up to our character here, and they look like they're made of wax, which I don't like. So I'm going to switch to the third viewport shading mode, which is the material preview mode, like so. Then I'll give it a little bit of time to load, and eventually we'll have all of our shaders compiled, and we'll see a little bit more of an accurate representation of what our character will look like in the final animation. But if this is a little too laggy for you, you can always go back to here and do this drop down right here and switch this on over to matcap. But for our purposes here, I'm gonna switch to the third viewport shading mode right here. But again, this is too laggy for you, go back to this viewport shading mode. This should run a little bit better. So we have our character all posed, but you're gonna notice there's a few things missing here. For example, the hair is kind of just floating in the air there. Her fingers are totally unposed, and that doesn't look super good, right? So we can actually fix this by pressing N when we're moused over the 3D viewport, then going to this Cloud Rig tab at the bottom here. And again, in the last video, that script we ran when we opened this blend file, the script we ran, that's what this created. It created this really nice little interface where we can turn on and off all the different aspects of our character here. So right here, we have our layers tab. So if we wanted to pose her hair and pose her fingers, all we need to do is click the hair and fingers buttons right here, which turns on the visibility of those respective layers. So now we can pose our hair by zooming in here, rotating this like so. And this is automatically gonna create keyframes in our dope sheet here as we're moving and rotating them because we have auto key on right here on the timeline. So I'm gonna rotate these more like so. So now her hair looks a little better. Now I'm gonna go to her fingers and pose them just by pressing R once again, just to make them look a little bit more natural, because by default, your hand kind of looks like this. Like this. Doesn't look like, you know, 3D default poses hands like that. It's a lot more relaxed. So we'll emulate that here by just curling our fingers like this. Like so. All right. We can move this one a little bit to be a little bit more relaxed looking as well. And then we can do the same on this side. There's actually a shortcut you can do to do that if you want to really speed up your workflow, where if we click and box select all of our finger bones like so, then we select the summary section right here in the dope sheet. That just makes sure we're selecting all of our keyframes. Then we press Ctrl+C. So that just copied all of our keyframes right here that we just inserted on our fingers here. Then if we box select all of our finger bones on this hand, I'm gonna have to hold Shift to box select that one as well. And then press not just Ctrl+V, that wouldn't work. You have to press Ctrl+Shift+V. There are not keyframes on this hand yet, so that's not gonna work. First of all, you need to press I, then insert a location, rotation, and scale on these keyframes. Then you press Control plus Shift plus V, which is awesome. That's how you copy a pose and mirror it in Blender. So Control plus Shift plus V, I know it's a little hard to remember, Control plus Shift plus V will paste your pose mirrored. So I could do the exact same thing on her foot, for example. So if I copied her foot right here, Control plus C to copy that foot position, then I went to this foot right here, then went Control plus Shift plus V, you're gonna see we're gonna get a perfect mirror of this pose on the opposite side, which is really, really awesome and handy. And it's gonna save you so much time, so I'm glad we can cover that early on here. I'll press Control plus Z to undo that though. And remember to constantly be pressing Control plus S to save your scene in Blender. That's really, really important. The autosave in Blender is really finicky, not always the best. So you always want to be spamming Control plus S as you're working on scenes that you care about and you don't want to lose data on, which is obviously that's going to be most of the time. So we've got our character posed here and they're looking pretty good. Just one more thing I wanted to show you is that, again, this is just an interface for modifying something we already have access to in Blender. That's what the script is doing. So if we go to the Object Data Properties tab here with the little guy running here, and then we see our Layers tab right here, notice what happens when we click between our layers in the UI here and what happens on this tab as we do that. You're going to notice that layers are turning on and off in this little section here because all the script is doing is controlling and making something a little bit more intuitive that Blender already has in it by default. So these are the layers on the armature that the person who created this character model and rig set up for us. So if we press Shift, we can actually switch between them right here. So clicking on that turns on the stretch bones. Holding Shift and clicking on this one turns on the face, what is that? Face extras bone? All right, cool. And if we just press left click on any of these layers, it actually only makes that specific layer visible. So if you hold Shift, you can make multiple visible, but if you just press left click, it'll be only that layer. But I want to go back to default, so I'm just gonna press Control plus Z a few times here. Go back to where we were. But now let's talk about IK versus FK. So those are big, scary words because IK is short for inverse kinematics and FK is short for forward kinematics. Those are big words and they sound really scary, but the short version is that IK is essentially posing by translation and FK is essentially posing by rotation. And by default, what we've been posing our character in, the way this character rig specifically is set up is that it's using IK for all of its controllers. So if we click on the hand here and we move it around like that, that is what's called an IK controller. Same with the foot here. We press G to move this. This is also an IK controller because we're translating and the joint is essentially doing its best to follow the position of this controller on our armature. However, there's also FK, but instead of telling you what it is, I'm going to show you what it is. So I'm going to zoom in on our armature here and click on this controller right here. Then I'm going to go to, scroll down here, I think it's, yeah, IK FK switch. So this tab right here, make sure that's expanded. Then I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can actually see what we're controlling here. So this option right here lets us seamlessly switch between IK and FK. It's what's called an IK FK toggle. So we have the left arm selected here. Excuse me, this is her right arm. So we want to do an IK FK switch on her right arm, right? So if we click on this button, bam, her right arm is now in FK. So what that means actually though, is if we click on her arm, then we press R, that's actually a stretch bone. Oops, we want to turn those off for now. So we're going to click this little stretch button in the rig layers so that's not like distracting us. But yeah, so these are the actual FK controllers on this character. So if we click on this and then we press G to translate, you're going to see this behaves a lot more differently than our IK controller. because this is not IK anymore. This is now forward kinematics, which means that if we rotate our character here, then press R, we're kind of posing them more like an action figure. So inverse kinematics is actually inspired by robotics, where you need like a robotic hand to like go to an exact position, go down, grab something, pick it up, go to a different exact position and drop it. So that makes a lot of sense in robotics. But FK, on the other hand, is a lot more like this, where you're posing an action figure and you're kind of just moving things and by rotation alone. So if I move this character's arm down, we're just rotating it one at a time like this. That's just like FK. So by rotating our character like this, we're moving them around just like an action figure. Now, I know what you might be thinking. That's a lot of theory. How does this actually work in the real world, though? So I'm going to show you that by showing you an animation I'm working on right now. One where I'm using FK and another where I'm using IK. So let's open that up right now. So this is an animation I'm actually working on right now for an animation project, right? So if I play this back, you're going to see we have a little bit of a drumming animation. It's not done, still working on it, but that's the idea, right? And actually I have my reference on the left here because I don't know how to drum and I needed reference. So yeah, this is the animation playing back here. And for this animation, I'm actually using IK. So if we go to this controller here, click on our armature, press Control plus Tab to go to pose mode, then click on this IK controller on the hand here. You're going to see that this controller, if we play this back, it's all in IK. So if I move this controller around, it's going to just follow the position by following our translation here. And we can still rotate it by doing rotation like this, but only on the hand. We can't like rotate the elbow unless we do a different controller. So for this animation, that made more sense to me because I needed to hit this cymbal on an exact position and I needed to hit this drum. I don't know what the main part of a drum is called. Please, musicians, tell me. This part of the drum, I needed to hit like exactly onto like a certain point, right? So we frame through our animation here. You're gonna see that eventually the right hand will hit this part of the drum exactly at that point because that was important. It kind of needed to hit that exact position. And what's nice about using IK here as well is that I could animate the upper torso, the shoulders, the pelvis even, and no matter how much I rotate those, it's not gonna like mess up the position of where I'm actually hitting the cymbal and the drum here. So for this shot, IK just kind of made more sense to me. But that is definitely not always the case. Let me show you a shot where I chose to use FK instead. So here's a shot where I chose to use FK instead. So if I play back my animation, you can see that our character is landing on a bed like so. And for this shot, if we look at our character's arms, you're gonna see that these are actually FK. So again, click on our armature, Control plus Tab, click on this bone. You're gonna see that this is controlled entirely by rotation, not translation, because this is FK. So if I frame by frame through this animation, you might start to see why I chose FK and not IK, because our character's arms are kind of dragging behind the main movement of this animation, right? So they kind of start, you know, kind of neutral by their sides, but as they fall more, it kind of drags behind their movement like this till they like start falling forward like that. So to me, doing this in FK just made way more sense because if it was in IK, I'd have to like be manually making sure the arcs look good for a movement like this and that it's tracking the position of our character every time they move forward like this, unless of course I parented it to their hips, but in this case I didn't. So to me, this made a lot more sense to animate this animation specifically in FK on their arms. Their feet are actually IK, but their arms are actually FK in this shot. So if we translate forward a few more frames, you can see that we actually have the arms. I know this is a lot of bones, so I'm gonna actually hide some of these. It's a little distracting. There we go. If we play back this animation, you can see that the arms kind of wiggle at the end there too, which again, that's a very difficult thing to show off and achieve using an IK controller. So For me, in this shot, I used FK, and I switch between which one I'm using depending on what I'm doing. So IK is really good at like holding objects. So if you're like grabbing a sword out of a stone and like it's in the environment, IK makes a lot of sense for that. Or if you have like a two-handed sword where you need one hand to perfectly track the other, you might actually want to have one hand be IK, but the other hand be FK. So you get like the really smooth arcs of FK, but you're constantly having like a perfect following motion because your left hand would be IK, but your right hand would be FK. And I know that's a little confusing and I'm throwing around terminology a lot here, but let me show you what this actually looks like in context. So we're gonna do the same motion on her left arm and right arm to kind of show you what I mean. So we're gonna click on her arm here. We're actually gonna select all of her bones and press I to insert a location, rotation, and scale. Then we're gonna go to frame 30, we'll say, and do I, insert location, rotation, and scale. Then we'll do P to set our preview range to just those frames and zoom in here. And we're gonna do the exact same pose on both of her arms, except one will be FK and the other will be IK. We're just gonna go from her arms being like this to her arms being like this. So we'll grab this controller right here, and because this one is IK, I press G to move it up, like this. Press R to rotate it, G to move it like this. So, and the thing about moving your arm up is that your arm isn't the only thing that moves. Your shoulder also goes up with it. So in our case here, we're gonna wanna grab her shoulder, rotate that up, kind of like that. And also adjust her elbow right here. So for IK controllers, there's also always going to be this bone right here. Sometimes this is done in rotation, but usually it's done in translation. And this bone right here kind of controls, if we actually move this down a little bit, you'll see it a little bit more clearly. This controller right here controls the rotation of your elbow. So I'm gonna put that, yeah, if you raise your arm up like this, so it'll actually be forward. So her thumb should be back. It's kind of like this kind of a pose. Her elbow should actually be in front of her for a pose like this. So I'm gonna move that forward here. And it looks like her thumb, yeah, her thumb's already back. Sweet. Feel free to use yourself as reference when you're doing these, by the way. It's very, very helpful. And rotate this, and we are good. All right. So that looks a little messed up there, but I think that's just a twist bone being funny. Ooh, scary. It's fine. For our purposes here, it doesn't really matter. Then we're gonna grab her right arm, right? And then we're going to rotate it up using FK. So instead of pressing G, we're gonna press R because that's how you rotate things in Blender. We're gonna do the exact same thing here. We're gonna grab her shoulder, press R to rotate it. And you're gonna notice, because we're moving her shoulder in FK, it's moving her whole arm. Whereas if we move her shoulder around in IK, her hand actually will stay in place. So that's another important difference to keep in mind between these two. So do the exact same thing. Her elbow should probably be facing forward, just like the other one. If we want to lock the axis of this rotation, we can press R, and then you can do Z, Y. Probably makes the most sense here. It's gonna look a little messed up too, but it's totally fine. And again, because we have auto key, we don't have to place a new keyframe every time we adjust these, which is really helpful. And there we go. So now let's play this back and I'll show you, kind of show you the difference between both of these. So give it space. Ooh, so this one looks really weird. And that's just because of how much rotation we have in that bone specifically. So that looks really messed up. We could fix that, I imagine, by just making sure that it only rotates up like this. We play this back. That's a little bit more of a normal expectation result. And if you want to clean it up a little bit more, you could just manually adjust it. So I'll put a frame on 15 there. We have a pretty clean movement there. Not perfect, but a little better. And you'll notice that if we actually look at our hand, it's creating an arc in the FK controller that is not being created on the IK controller. And that's because FK is dealing with rotation and IK is dealing with solely translation. And we can actually visualize this using the motion path tool. So I'm going to click on our wrist controller right here on our FK arm, which is our right arm. Then I hit calculate and hit OK. Then we're going to have a preview of what is called an arc, which is just an animation term for kind of visualizing the position of things in space, because the animation theory is that clean arcs, kind of like this one, where there's like a really smooth like half circle or whatever the arcs might being. The theory is that movements like that are a little bit more realistic and beautiful to our eyes. So if we hit play here, you're going to see that our hand on the right here has a really smooth, perfect arc to it, which is what we want. We love seeing that in animation. But what happens if we do the exact same thing on our arm here, our IK arm? So I'm going to hit calculate, then I get OK. And immediately you can see a difference between these two, right? This is a little bit more realistic when it comes to movement, whereas this is just completely mechanical and fake feeling. So that doesn't mean IK is bad, but it does mean when you're using IK, you have to be mindful of the fact that the arcs it creates are not good looking. You have to go out of your way to make sure that your IK movement looks solid and has a clean arc to it. So even here, we can go to frame 15, and just by looking at this, we can see this is problematic. This is not what it should look like, right? We can go to frame 15 and kind of just move this forward. And look at that! Our arc now looks a heck of a lot like the arc on our FK controller, right? So if we play here, you're going to see that this looks a lot more natural just by moving that a little bit forward. Neither of these are perfect by any means, but this is kind of just to illustrate a point, right? But that about covers it. That is the difference between IK versus FK and everything you need to know about animation layers in Blender. We are getting dangerously close to finishing this series, so if you've got it this far, that's awesome. Congratulations. Please comment below if you thought this video was helpful. Check out my Patreon to get this shirt. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Let's talk about cameras. Depth of field, camera cuts, all that stuff, how to animate cameras. Let's talk about all of that right now. So the cool part about every Blender scene is that it actually starts with a camera. If you want to make a new Blender scene, you can always just go to File, New, General, bam, you're in a default Blender scene, which has a camera right here, which I'm going to select right now. And if you want to view the world through the lens of this camera, again, you can press this little camera button right here, or you can press 0 on your numpad to jump through the view of the world in your scene through your actual camera lens. And for this tutorial, we are going to use Blender Eevee as a render engine, just because it makes things a lot easier. Then we're going to press Z and switch our rendering mode to rendered, which you can also do with this little menu up here by pressing that the rightmost little sphere, excuse me. And there we go. We now have our scene in render view, which was gonna just let us preview the changes we're making to our cameras a lot easier. You can also add cameras to Blender by pressing Shift+A and clicking camera right here. But again, our scene starts with a camera, so we don't really need to do that right now. So now that we're viewing our scene through our camera lens, you're gonna see this little orange square right here. Or at least it is orange when your camera is actually selected, right? That is the lens in which your camera is seeing your 3D scene. And to make that even more obvious, I'm gonna click on my camera right here, go to the little camera tab that appears when you have a camera object selected in object mode in Blender, right? So make sure you're in object mode, you have your camera selected, then this appears. Then I'm gonna go to viewport display, and then I'm gonna see this little passepartout option, which probably just butchered the pronunciation of. I am very not French. But if we change this option, right? So if we drag this around and move this all the way to the right, that gives you a very clear idea of what you're going to be seeing when you go to render animation in this scene. And personally, I always have this option all the way to the right because I want a very clear idea of what is and isn't in my camera's view when I'm doing animation work in Blender. So Now let's talk about animating and moving our camera. So just like any other object in Blender, I can come out of this view here and I press G to move it around, press R to rotate it, and it's a little bit hard to see what we're actually doing with our camera here, right? So I'm gonna drag, I'm gonna press right click to cancel that. I'm actually gonna drag from here to create a new 3D viewport, so I'm gonna do that. Then I'm gonna press 0, so we're seeing our camera view through the lens of our camera on this rightmost 3D viewport, right? Which is actually exactly what they do in the animation viewport, just opposite. So I'm gonna go back to the layout view though. And now that we have this view on our rightmost 3D viewport, I'm gonna start rotating our camera right here. You're gonna see that our camera lens is moving around. If we rotate it, it's moving around if we translate it as well. So very, very useful to have two views so you can get a really good idea of what's happening in your camera lens while also being free to move around however you so please in the leftmost 3D viewport, right? But there's also two other really useful ways to move our camera around in Blender. And probably the most common that you see people using is by pressing N, going to View, then clicking this little camera to view option right here under View Lock. Now, you're going to notice something. If we zoom out and frame our camera here in this leftmost viewport, then start rotating our camera in this viewport, you're going to see that our camera actually follows our normal movement patterns in Blender. So if we zoom in and out, our camera is moving in and out. If we rotate our camera and by orbiting around our cube, our camera is also orbiting around our cube. So this just locks the movement of the camera to the movement in your 3D viewport, which is really cool. Very fast way of doing things. But I'll warn you now, it's really easy to forget to turn this off and you'll totally mess up a shot and it's super annoying because you maybe forget to key it or whatever. So always remember when you're done adjusting your camera here, turn this off. And there's one final way to move your camera in Blender, which is personally what I almost always use actually. And it is by, I'm gonna hide this menu by pressing N, and then I'm gonna press Shift plus tilde. Now, if you do not know what tilde is, that is the button below escape on your keyboard or to the left of 1 on your keyboard. So that is tilde, it's above tab as well. So it's in that area on your keyboard. So if you press Shift plus tilde, you can move your camera around, so long as you are moused over a 3D viewport with an active camera, that is. Technically, I guess you can do it whenever you want in the 3D viewport, but for our purposes here, just make sure this viewport is active by clicking into it, then press Shift plus Tab. Now you're able to move your camera around as if it's like a first-person shooter game. So if you've played, Minecraft, Call of Duty, any FPS game in the world, you're going to be really comfortable with this because you move around with WASD. You can look around just by using your mouse in first person, and you can go up and down by pressing Q to go down and E to go up. But if that's all hard to remember, there's this really useful little dialog box that pops up right at the bottom. So look right over there. The very bottom of Blender, right? You can see all the hotkeys associated with this mode. And I just find this mode to be the most useful and fast. And you can also use the scroll wheel in and out to change your movement speed overall. You press Shift to go faster and Alt to go move slower. So this is honestly what I'm almost always using in Blender. I'll just move it around like this. Then I'll press N, go to Item, and just use the rotation values right here while holding Shift usually, just to do my fine-tuned rotation adjustments of a camera. Then I'll just press N to hide that again, Shift plus tilde, adjust my camera even more if I need to, and that's basically what I usually do to move around cameras in Blender. So that's how I personally do it. But again, say you want to animate a camera, right? Well, remember, this auto keying option, if we click it on in our timeline here, then we move our camera around in either of these options. Actually, we do need one keyframe first. So we're gonna have to key our camera by making sure it's selected right there, pressing I, and then doing a location, rotation, and scale keyframe. And now our camera is keyed, of course. So we go to frame 30 here, and then we move our camera using Shift plus tilde, then left click to confirm. We're going to place a new keyframe right there, and I'll set my preview range once again by pressing P and box selecting those two frames and hitting play. Now our camera's animating. So just like every other object we've animated so far, you animate cameras in Blender the exact same way. But if you've held a real camera before, you know that you can also change the zoom, right? So on this camera, you adjust this little dial here and we're zooming in and out. That is called adjusting the focal length, which is what all these little, I don't know if it's going to be in focus, but all these little numbers you can see on this part of a camera, that is the focal length, right? And each lens a camera has like a certain focal length distance. Sometimes it's locked, it's fixed. Sometimes it's adjustable, like this lens that can zoom in and out like that. And the same thing applies to Blender. So that is available right here when you have your object, your camera object selected in Blender. You have the focal length option right here, which is your zoom. So we were just moving our camera around, but if we actually want to zoom it in and out, we adjust this option. So if I move this around, you're going to see 10 millimeters, super fisheye, very weird looking, probably don't want to use that super often. And 150 millimeters is like real zoomed in. You're like shooting wildlife photography or something at that point. That's like extreme zoom level. So by default, I think it's 50, right? Yeah, default is 50. And remember, if you ever want to go back to a default value in Blender, mouse over it and press backspace on your keyboard to go to that value. There's also depth of field right here. So I'm going to click on that right now and go to f-stop right here. So you can think of f-stop as your blur amount, basically. And depth of field is kind of just like the plane of focus that you have for your camera in Blender. And your real eye does this all the time. If you hold up your finger right in front of you, if you look right at it, you're going to notice that everything behind your finger becomes super blurry. And that's kind of the concept behind depth of field, except it's a plane in Blender. You're moving in and out to change what is and isn't in focus. So if I change my f-stop all the way to something ridiculously small, like 0.1, you're going to see our cube gets real blurry here. And to make it pin sharp and in focus, we can adjust our focus distance. So if I hold left click on this, then adjust this, you're going to see that it slowly starts to get more and more in focus until this corner right here. And I'm just zooming in and out with shift here and holding middle mouse and shift to move around this little area inside of our camera. So middle mouse to zoom, holding shift and middle click to kind of pan around this view. And I'm going to zoom in right here. And as you can see, this part is razor sharp in focus, but everything behind it is super blurry because we have such a ridiculously low f-stop number, which I'll increase a little bit just to show you that if I increase this, basically everything's in focus. If I decrease this, only this little corner of the cube is in focus, right? There's also this blades option right here, which kind of gives you a bokeh depth of field effect. It is extremely subtle in this case, and it's usually pretty subtle in Blender. It's not the most obvious thing in the world, but I usually have this turned up because it can be a nice little addition to your depth of field in the scene, especially if I have a bunch of like bright lights behind you or something's pretty overexposed. It can look really nice. And we can also animate all of these effects by mousing over them and pressing I. So of course that's going to animate on our currently active key, which is, or excuse me, currently active frame, which is frame 25 in our case here. But I'm going to go back to frame 1, then I'm going to mouse over this focal length value and press I. Now that is a keyed value, and I'm going to go to frame 30, then drag this up, which will automatically place a new keyframe, but only because we have auto key right here enabled. So I'm going to zoom out here, go back to frame 1, hit play, and look at this. We have a really cool little camera zoom animation as if we're like rotating around this cube and like zooming in like that. Pretty cool stuff. And we could also animate the focus distance here. We could animate the f-stop. So say we wanted this to start out really blurry. We could animate this and this value on frame 1 and 30 and drag this way in the distance and hit play. Kind of gets pin razor sharp at the end there, as if we're adjusting our focal distance on a camera in real time, which is really cool. And we can also go to the graph editor here to adjust all these values individually. So we have all of our transforms right here for the camera object. So we have all of our transforms for our camera here. And right here, we have all these values we just adjusted in the actual like object properties of our camera. So that's going to be things like the focal length, focal distance, you know, the blur amount, the depth of field, all that kind of stuff. That's going to be under here. The actual rotation, location, and scale is going to be under here on our camera in the graph editor. And lastly, I want to briefly talk about how to do camera cuts in Blender. But before we talk about camera cuts in Blender, let's talk about how real camera cuts are done, right? This is going to sound really obvious when I say this out loud, but if you have a scene with actors in it or objects or whatever, and you need to cut from one point to another, generally, the way that's done in the real world is you'll have multiple cameras. So if I'm photographing someone like right here, and I have a camera overhead here, but I want to cut in the very next shot to a lower angle as she's turning, for example, I would ideally do that with two different cameras rather than trying to quickly move this camera around in order to get that coverage that we need for that angle, right? And the same thing is true with Blender, where you don't really want to have a camera cut that is done purely in animation. So if I turn off my preview range, go to frame 31 and move my camera around here like that. Let's play this back, see what happens. That looks fine. That is technically a camera cut that would work. But this introduces numerous problems that you might not really think about at first. And I certainly didn't think about at first until you start getting into rendering or any other parts of the pipeline where you're editing camera animation data. Because really, this is going to create issues with motion blur if you render this, because as far as Blender is concerned, this isn't a cut. You are moving your camera extremely quickly from one point to another. So Blender is going to render this frame with a ton of motion blur and it's going to look terrible. So that's one problem with camera cuts, right? But the other problem with camera cuts in Blender is that if you want to adjust this animation data, you're going to have to always be worrying about this keyframe because you have to always keep it at the same place. You can't like extend the timing of this to be a little bit longer because then it's just going to be transitioning into this keyframe instead. So there's a solution to this, and that's just using multiple cameras. And a way to set up multiple cuts in Blender is by using the marker system we briefly touched on. So I'm going to undo that right here and delete this keyframe. And I'm going to go to frame 1, which is where we want our first cut, and set our default camera to our first cut by clicking on it, then going to marker, then bind camera to markers. Then where I want my cut, which is frame 31, I'm going to select this camera, then go to marker, bind camera to markers. Then I'm going to adjust the position of this camera to be right here, we'll say. And I'll delete all the keyframes before this to show you that this is not using this previous animation data. This is a completely different camera on a completely different cut. And I'll move over here and make it move to the right a little bit. Now, if I play this back, it's going to start with this camera and cut to this camera on frame 31. So if I play this back, go from the first camera to the second camera. So there's no animation data beyond this point on this camera, but we still see movement here because we're cutting to this camera in the 3D viewport, which is really awesome and how I would recommend everybody do camera cuts in Blender. But that about covers it. In the next videos, we're going to talk about lighting, and we're really close to being done with this series, so congratulations if you've gotten this far. Check out the Patreon if you haven't, get access to our exclusive Discord community, and I'll see you soon. Let's talk about everything you need to know to light characters for animations in Blender. So this is a default Blender scene, actually. This model that I'm using right here is actually by Kaoru Sakaki, and you can see their ArtStation here. They have some really amazing 3D anime sculpts that they've done. I'm pretty sure they actually sculpt for like real anime figures, which is crazy. So really good person to follow and look to if you're looking to get into that kind of stuff. But amazingly, if we go to their store tab on their ArtStation, which will be linked in the comment section below, by the way, if we go to the store tab here and go to this pack right here, they actually have, and I'm going to just show that, they actually have an amazing anime base mesh, which is the same base mesh we're using for this tutorial, just for demonstration purposes, because I wanted to keep this as real world and useful as possible. So this is the base mesh we're using for this tutorial. Unfortunately, this is only available for ZBrush, meaning that this is in, I think, ZTL format, and I had to import it into ZBrush, then export it to Blender. I will provide a FBX of this model if you would like to use it, just for to follow along with this tutorial. You do not need to follow along with this tutorial. We're just gonna kind of go over the fundamentals of lighting, but taking notes I'm sure would be helpful. So that's the background of how this character model got into our scene here, and if you want to download it, I'll have a link to that in the description below. Just keep in mind that might need to get taken down at some point, and again, you do not need to download that model to follow along with this tutorial. So let's talk about lighting. And for this tutorial, we're actually going to use Eevee. So I'm going to go to the rendering tab right here and make sure that render engine is set to Eevee, just so we can get instant feedback and results on our model here. By default, Blender is using this view right here, which is called the solid view. This has no lighting information in it whatsoever. It has this like preview, but this is not what your final animation is actually going to look like. To get a preview of what that's going to look like, you need to go to the top right here and go to the rendered view, or a faster way of doing that is by pressing Z on your keyboard and then going to rendered up here. You get this little nice pie menu. You can switch to wireframe to, or material preview, but in our cases here, we want to go to rendered, right? So this is what Blender starts with. Every Blender scene by default starts with one light in it, and that is a point light. That is what this is called. And to make our scene look a little bit better, especially for previewing purposes here, I'm going to go to the render tab, then I'm going to go to shadows, and just for our purposes here, I wouldn't recommend this for necessarily every Eevee scene. For our purposes here, I'm going to max out the cube size and the cascade size right here for our shadow settings. And the reason why I'm doing that is just because that's going to make our shadows look nice and crisp, and it's going to be a little bit clearer what we're changing and doing in this tutorial. Just keep in mind, by doing that, you're obviously going to be degrading the performance in your scene at the cost of having sharper, higher resolution shadows by increasing these values. So yeah, I also want to go to the top right here to this little drop down right here where we can turn on and off the scene world. So for our purposes here for this tutorial, I'm going to turn off the scene world that is in the default Blender scene, then turn the strength of this very low to something like 0.1 here, which is just changing the settings of our HDRI as we're previewing our lighting changes here. So yeah, but without further ado, let's actually talk about lighting. So by default, this is a point light that is in your Blender scene, and to move it around, all you need to do is click on it, press G, and bada bing, bada boom, you have a point light moving around and affecting the light on your character, like so. And if we go to this light, I believe, yeah, it actually might be dimmer for you by default. It might be 10 watts, which is why it was like so bright beforehand. To get to the default value on any value in Blender, again, mouse over it and press backspace to go back to that default value. I'll turn that a little bit up to like 100 to make that a little bit more obvious though. And as we can see here by looking in this tab, there are 4 different types of lights in Blender. There's a point light, which is the default light that comes with every Blender scene. There's a sun, spot, and area light. And a point light you can kind of think of like a torch. So if I actually click on this color panel right here, we can actually change the color of our light, and it'll make my analogy a little bit more obvious. So I will click on this little white part right here, and then click on this orange part of the color wheel to make this point light orange. Now, as I move my point light around, you're going to see that the shadowing on our character is changing and moving around, because the way a point light works is basically light is bouncing off in every direction around it kind of evenly. It's like a spherical light that's like going everywhere. That's the same way, a lantern or a torch works, or like a lightning bug, that kind of stuff. That's how a point light works in Blender. It's like a spherical radius around the light that it's lighting up. So as we move this around, you can see that the shadows on our character are changing, because on a 360-degree radius around our light, that is where light is coming out from. And because of that, because it's a point light, if we rotate it, you're going to notice something interesting in that nothing is actually happening, and it's not being affected by our rotations whatsoever. That is because this is a point light, and the only thing that matters with a point light is the point of space that it occupies. So translation, very important for a point light. Rotation does absolutely nothing on a point light, which is the exact opposite behavior of the sunlight, which we'll get to in a second here. But before that, I want to talk about the shadow settings right here, because clip start and bias, those are kind of useful sometimes. You can hover over them to see what they do. But the one I'm using constantly is this setting right here, which is contact shadows, which basically, as it says here, it uses screen space ray tracing to have correct shadowing near occluder or for small features that does not appear in shadow maps. So this basically uses screen space ray tracing to get more accurate, realistic shadowing on your characters or objects in your scene. So if I click this, you're going to see the difference right off the bat. We look at her fingers here. Those are receiving much more realistic shadows. We look at the crotch area right here. You can see again, the shadows are cascading in a more realistic way. We see it look under her neck. You can also see that. It's just a little bit more realistic of a result, especially on the sunlight when it comes to the cast shadows. But again, this is not for free. This comes at a performance cost. So if you enable this on like every light in your scene, it might start to chug. Just keep that in mind. But now let's talk about the sunlight. So any light in Blender, you can switch to a different light type just by selecting it rather, and then going to this green tab, then clicking sun, for example, if we wanted a sunlight. But again, you can also press Shift plus A and then go to the light tab, and we could spawn in another sunlight right here. But for our purposes here, we're just going to click it to sun, because that's just a little bit faster, right? So this is the sunlight, and unlike the point light, if we press G to move around the sunlight, absolutely nothing happens. So the sun is kind of like the opposite of a point light, where the only thing that matters on a sunlight is the rotation. And as you might expect, the sun functions a lot like our sun, where it's very bright and create very harsh, sharp shadows, but it's nice, even lighting across your scene. So if I lower this strength a lot, because this is very bright, to like 5 here, you're going to see that it's a very nice, even lighting across our figure as we're rotating our sun around like so. And by rotating it like this and turning on contact shadows on and off, I think this is an even more obvious example of what contact shadows do. It's a lot more realistic of a result, but it comes at a performance cost for sure. So just keep that in mind. You might also notice this little dot right here on our sunlight, which is not a thing on the point light, because this lets us aim our sun, which is really, really cool. So if I hold left click on this, then drag onto somewhere on our model, it'll basically aim our sun exactly to that part of the geometry on the model. So by releasing left click right there and zooming in, we can see that it's dead on exactly where I put my mouse there, but there's also a shortcut for that. So we can see by hovering over it here, it's Shift plus T. So if I press Shift plus T with my sunlight selected, I can aim my sunlight around like this, which is really, really cool. So that's just a really fast way of like rotating and aiming lights, which is particularly useful for the next light type, which is spot. So unlike sun, which is kind of like universal and it's like hitting everything in your scene, spot is a lot more focused. It's a lot more like stage lighting, where if I increase this power here to like, I don't know, 180, and then press G to move it, and then Shift plus T to aim it, this is a lot more like, the spotlighting you'd have on a stage for a play or something like that, where you have barn doors on your light and you're kind of focusing it in one specific area. So we can actually make this a little bit more of intense and obvious of an effect by changing the spot shape setting, which this spot shape setting is only available for spotlights. So if I change the size here so it's a little bit more focused like that, we're going to see that, oh, maybe it actually doesn't get more intense. That might be a cycles thing. My apologies. But in any case, that does limit the cone radius on this light. It'll just make your light a lot more focused, right? And unlike the sunlight and unlike the point light, both translation and rotation on a spotlight matters. So we can move our spotlight around, say we want it in front of our character, press G to move it, then we press Shift plus T to aim it at them, and look at this. It's very, very cool how we can like aim that around and do highly specific centralized lighting on our character if we want like a really specific, like tight lighting setup. So that's pretty cool, right? And again, we can turn on contact shadows to get a little bit more realistic shadowing on them. And turn this up a little bit more just to make it a little bit more obvious what that's doing, right? You can also change this blend setting right here, which will just change how sharp the fall off on the edge of our spotlight is. So if I lower this a lot, you can see that it becomes super like pin sharp fall off. But if I increase this, the shadowing becomes very gradual, very like gradual gradient over the surface of our figure here. And again, we can change this to any color we want by clicking on this color. Say we want this blue, bada bing, bada boom, it's blue now. And for all these lights, you've probably noticed this diffuse, specular, and volume setting. This is just for changing how specific light interacts with either diffuse, specular, or volumes in Blender, which sounds really confusing, but I'm going to explain it by turning the diffuse all the way down and notice what happens when we do that. This is just the specular highlights that our model is receiving because I believe this is using principled BSDF material on it, which means that does have specular and diffuse just built into it. So by just turning on this diffuse, we can kind of like exaggerate the specularity of this light. Or can you actually set this to 2? You can. So if you want to exaggerate the specularity on something via doing it on the light, this is a great way of doing it. Or if you want to like tone down how bright a diffuse part on just one light is, this is just a nice little art hack where you can kind of, you know, more carefully control how the materials are interacting with the lights in your scene. So that's a nice option to have. I'm going to return all of these back to 1 though. And the final light type in Blender is area. So if I click on area, we're going to see that we're not actually seeing too much of a difference. But if we zoom in on our light, you know, press shift, zoom in on this, you're going to see that this actually has a little bit of a plane on it. So if I hold left click on this, I can actually resize this rectangle shape, right? And then if I release, then bring this closer to my model, it's going to come a little bit more obvious what this is doing. So area is exactly what it sounds like. It makes an area of light that it projects light from, or an area of volume that it's projecting light from, I guess more accurately. So in our case here, the shape of our light is a rectangle, but you can actually change that. So I can click right here to change this to a square shape. And if we resize it, you're going to see that's always going to be a square shape. I can make this a disc shape and resize it like this. And I can also make this a ellipse shape, which is just like our rectangle shape in that it's kind of an unlocked aspect ratio like that. And you can see by looking at our character here, changing the size of this is changing how the shadows are falling off. So having it bigger here is making a lot more of a gradual transition between the light and the dark shadows here. But if I make this real uber tight, makes it slightly sharper. Yeah, it makes our shadows a little bit more sharper in how they fall off. So in our case here, I'll make this nice and big and lower the power way down to like 100-ish, like so. And yeah, that is basically an area light. It's actually one of the least complicated ones. Like there's no special settings here. You have contact shadows. And you can modify all the previous settings of the last ones. It's actually largely the same as all the other light types. So if I wanted to do nice little portrait lighting here, I could set this to a rectangle shape. Then I could press Shift plus A to add in a sunlight. And then I can rotate this light around by moving it over here, then pressing Shift plus T to put it behind her and actually raise that up a little bit more and press Shift plus T to rotate that again, just as a fast way to get rim lighting, because I'll set this to a 10, maybe? Yeah, just to get some nice rim lighting around here. Then I can grab this area light by clicking on it, press G, Shift plus T to aim it at her, G again, Shift plus T to aim it at her, and we can add a fill light, as they're called. So I could press Shift plus A, then add a spotlight, press G to move the spotlight, Shift plus T to put it on the shadowed area of her right there. Then I can increase the power to make it a little bit more obvious. And look at that, we have some really nice portrait lighting that's like nice and smooth, but we got that nice like highlight around her to like accentuate her form. And yeah, that's kind of how lighting works in Blender. You can also animate all of these lights by turning on Auto key, just shift selecting all of them like this. So that's all of our lights selected. Then I'm going to press hide, insert location, rotation, and scale. Then I'll go forward to frame 30 here. Just do a different lighting setup. So I move this here, press Shift T, move this here, Shift plus T, and we don't have to key these because we have auto key on, and we key the first keyframe there, right? Then click on the sun, rotate it a little bit like that. And then if we go to the first frame, play this back, our lighting setup changes pretty drastically there. And it's all animated in real time thanks to Eevee. We get a nice little preview of all the changes we just made. And just like with cameras, we can animate these different values in Blender by hovering over them and pressing I. Then I'm going to go back to the first frame here because this is the sun strength setting. Then press I again. Now if I go back to frame 30, where we have that first keyframe, or I guess second, because there's one on frame 30 right now and one on frame 1. So if I go to that keyframe and increase the strength to we'll decrease the strength actually to 0, just for preview purposes here, we're going to see that our sun will gradually lose strength until completely fading out at the end there. And we'll make that a little bit more obvious. Playing this back. And yeah, that's how you animate lighting. That's basically everything you need to know about lights in Blender. And yeah, I think that's about it. So thank you so much for watching. And if you have any questions at all, please leave them in the comment section below. I hope it was helpful. Check out the Patreon if you haven't already, and see you in the next one. Render properties in Blender are crucial for fine-tuning the look and feel of your animations in Blender and a whole lot more. So let's talk about everything you need to know about them right now. So in this video, I'm once again using Kaoru Sakaki's Animate base mesh. You do not need to download this to follow along. You could just, follow along, watch the video and take notes if you want to. But if you do want to follow along, I will have a link to download this in the description below, along with a link to the original post and Kaoru Sakaki's work, because it's really, really good. So for this tutorial, I'm going to use Eevee, which we can go to the render tab right here and see that I have selected as my active render engine. That's just because Eevee is really quick and a lot more easy to demonstrate what these settings actually do. You're going to get a completely different set of settings, but if you can go to cycles here, you're going to see, because Eevee is a real-time renderer. It's a real-time renderer in the same way that game engines are, like Unity or Unreal, where things are fast, they're instant, you can preview what's going on immediately at the cost of realism, right? So a lot of the things in Eevee, like the shadows and the lighting, a lot of this stuff is totally hacked and faked. It's not realistic or it's not usually ray traced. It's usually just using a bunch of hacks and techniques to quickly simulate what that kind of feels like for things like refractions and shadows and lighting, all that kind of stuff. So Eevee is great for me because I really love non-photorealism. I love things that are kind of pushed and exaggerated, but Cycles is really good for photorealism. But for this tutorial here, we're going to use Eevee because that's just kind of what I use for all of my stuff. So first setting I'm going to talk about here is viewport denoising. I'm going to be honest, I almost always have that off because, and I'm not going to be able to preview it here, but basically viewport denoising adds a ghosting effect. Even if you hover over it here, it says it denoises the image using temporal reprojection and can leave some ghosting. So when you're animating and you're playing back your animations, you're going to see a lot of ghosting behind your character and stuff that's really distracting, and I imagine doesn't help the performance of your viewport either. So I almost always have this off, honestly. I don't like how it looks. I don't feel like my images in Eevee even need denoising most of the time, so I almost always have that off personally. Next up here is ambient occlusion, which we're not going to see the changes of because we are actually in solid view right now. So to change our render view in Blender, we can press C, and I will go to rendered view right here, which also changes our view right there. And this looks pretty ugly. I don't like how this looks because all I did to get this character in our scene is go to File, Import, FBX. This is just the default Blender scene other than that. And I deleted our cube, of course. So I'm gonna change this to a sunlight by clicking on our light here, going to sun, then pressing RR to rotate it like this. Then lower the strength down way more to 10, even lower than 10, like that. All right. So we'll have one sun right here, this. Then I'll Shift D to duplicate our sun, rotate the sun behind our character, increase the strength to 10. So we get like a little bit of rim lighting behind her like that. There we go. All right, so now with our lighting setup, let's go back to the render tab right here and turn on ambient occlusion. So when we turn on ambient occlusion, you're going to see that there's a very subtle shift in this character. Actually, this is actually like way more obvious in other scenes, but I'll make it super obvious by zooming in on her torso area here and turning it on. And you can see that by clicking this option enable, we're getting more subtle shadowing here like so. So ambient occlusion is awesome because it can give a really nice like indirect shadowing effect on small crevices in your scene and just make them look a lot more believable and realistic. I think we'll even see a little bit of that on her hand here. It's very subtle. It's actually extremely subtle in this scene. You know what? I'll get to a different scene to make this a little bit more obvious real quick. So here's another scene I'm working on right now. And if I go to the Render tab and go to Ambient Occlusion here and turn it on and off, it's going to be a little bit more obvious what this is actually doing. So keep on turning that on and off. It just creates a soft shadowing for occluded areas in your scene. So check out under the hair there, check out the ring in her hand here and under her neck. You're going to see that those areas become a lot more believable and realistic feeling. So ambient occlusion is really good for that kind of stuff. So that's what ambient occlusion does. I have that enabled a lot of the time. And right under ambient occlusion is this option right here called bloom. So bloom will essentially make bright areas in our scene bloom out and get like a soft haloing effect around them, which makes them feel a lot more believable and realistic almost. So if I enable it here, it's going to be real subtle. So I'm going to actually click on our light here and make this like 100 to make this super obvious what this is doing. Let's just do 55. 100's a bit much. So now if I go to my render properties tab and enable bloom, and zoom in here, you're going to kind of see what's happening, right? These heavily lit areas bloom out and get soft highlights around them. And it's awesome. I almost always have bloom enabled, even if it's very subtle, because it adds this really nice glowing effect around light sources. So that's a sunlight source, and that's one way to get the bloom effect. But if I have an emission in my scene, that's another really good way of showing off this effect. So I'll actually do that right now by clicking on our character here, going to their material properties tab, and switching them over to an emission. So an emission in Blender is just a glowing material. An emission is just a material that's glowing, basically. It's very common to use these in stylized 3D animations. So I'll set the strength of this to 2, and I'll even change the color just for fun to like green, I guess. Now, this is glowing, but it doesn't really feel like it's glowing until we go back to our render tab here, turn on bloom. Now it really feels like this is glowing, like she's radioactive or something, right? So bloom is a really good option if you want things to glow. You can also change the color right here. So I could change this to like blue or a red, which I love changing the color of this. If I'm changing a setting on bloom, it's either going to be the color or the threshold. Those are the ones I use the most often. So I can press backspace on those to reset them to default, of course. So yeah, that's bloom. I'm going to switch this back to principled BSDF, which is what we were on, and go back to our render tab here. So that's bloom. There's also depth of field, which is mostly a camera controlled setting, but sometimes I do use this high quality slight defocus and jitter camera settings right here. So those are nice. Screen space reflections are another extremely useful setting to have in Eevee. Again, a screen space reflection is not physically accurate. 90% of everything Eevee is doing is not physically accurate, but it can really pump up your realism and make things feel a lot more realistic. So by enabling this right now, you're going to see that there's actually even a little bit of effect here, even on this material, even though it's kind of, diffuse and not super specular. You can see that there's a little bit more of a highlight under her arm here, but it's pretty subtle, right? But if I turn this off and then go to our material properties once again, and make her, because we're on principled BSDF, make this a metallic material by dragging this to the right. This is what our metallic material is going to look like right now. And this is fine. It's clearly not super realistic. Kind of reminds me of like Mario 64 metal, but you know, it's not that bad. However, if we enable screen space reflections, you're going to see that you get a lot more of a realistic like reflection in the metal itself, which is really cool. And I believe it will also kind of reflect the elements we have in our scene here. So I should try that by spawning in a mesh. I hope I'm not wrong about this. That'd be embarrassing. No, yeah, it does. Okay. So see if we'll make this a new material. We'll make this an emission, just make this super, super obvious. Make it a green emission. So you can see that this is screen space reflections is actually taking the data from our scene and our camera to calculate like reflections off of different things in our scene as well, which just makes this metallic effect, glass effects, reflections in general, a lot more realistic feeling. So if I turn this off, you'll see we have none of that, but if I turn this on again, we have that kind of reflection, which is awesome. So that's cool, right? But there's also this refraction setting in screen space reflections. So there's reflections, which are the reflections in our scene, but then there's refraction. So refraction is kind of, you know, think of like a glass bottle or any kind of glass container, really. When light is going through that glass, it gets refracted and kind of gives the glass that warbly effect when you're looking through it, and everything through it looks a little bit, you know, looks a little warbly. That's kind of what refraction is. So if I enable refraction here, we're going to see basically no change because this is a completely metallic surface, right? But if we click on our material tab once again on our character here, and we go to glass BSDF. So click on glass BSDF. We can already see a little bit of our cube here because we have the screen space refractions. However, if we move our character to the side here, we're actually not going to see them through the cube, which you would kind of expect if this is glass, right? Because you can see through glass. That doesn't feel right. And the reason for that is we need to go to our settings on our material here and enable screen space refraction, which is actually ray trace screen space refraction. It's pretty neat, Eevee. So if I enable this, now you can see that, oh yeah, this is starting to feel way more like glass because, and I'll make this smaller to make this a little bit more obvious what's happening here. Move it like this. Now this feels like glass where it's kind of refracting things around it as they become like behind the object. So if I turn that off again, you're going to see with that we don't have that effect through the object. We only have the reflections for the cube, which we can't even see because it's not big enough and close enough. But now we have the refractions through the surface itself, which makes it feel a lot more glass-like. We could probably even change the roughness to make it even more, to kind of exaggerate that effect, right? So that's pretty cool. That's what screen space refractions are. They kind of add a transparent refraction effect to your objects in your scene. So I guess we'll just leave it like that for now, because the next option, which is super, super important for animation, is motion blur. If you're making an animation at 24 FPS and rendering it out without motion blur, you are shooting yourself in the foot. It's going to look super stuttery, and you're not going to have a good time looking at that animation. And if you're doing most animations, unless you're exporting to a game engine, you should probably just be animating them at 24 FPS anyway. It's a standard for a reason. So by enabling motion blur, when we move our objects in our scene, they're going to have motion blur, right? So if I turn on auto key here, press P to set my play range from 1 to 25, we'll say. Then press I to insert a location, rotation, and scale. Go to frame 25, move it on the x-axis like this. Then I'm going to move my camera by pressing 0 on my numpad, pressing Shift plus tilde, go right next to my cube to make this motion blur super obvious. Then I go to frame 14 here, go to render image, you're going to see that our cube is super blurry. If I turn off motion blur, go to render image, our cube is like razor sharp, which is great for certain styles and certain things, but you have an animation at 24 FPS, again, please enable motion blur. It's gonna look real rough if you don't. The only settings you need to worry about here are the shutter speed and the steps. The shutter speed is basically how much blur your motion blur has. So if I drag this all the way to the right, go to render image, render image, not render animation, silly me. That's gonna be super blurry. And if I drag this all the way to the left, to render image, it's gonna basically be like pin razor sharp. So that's your blur amount basically. I usually keep that around like 50 or like 75, depending on the shot, right? And steps is basically your motion blur quality level. I usually keep this for a final render for animation. I'll usually put this at like 2 or 3. So if we render this out, render image like so, it just makes the motion blur quality a little bit higher. There's more sampling there, so it's a lot less pixelated and aliased, basically. So that is motion blur. There's also volumetrics, which I don't have in my scene, and I'm not going to bother adding to my scene because it's like a whole thing. But basically, volumetrics are a way to add things like clouds, smoke, and volumes into your scene, which is really good for realism and PBR stuff, but probably not what you're going to use if you're doing like stylized animations anyway. But these are good options to explore. Tile size, putting that lower will make your volumetrics higher resolution, and volumetric shadows will add shadowing in your volumetrics, which is also another very useful setting to have. Other than that, though, there's also shadows right here. So if I click on our character here, go back to this being a principled BSDF, and zoom in on them, if we increase the shadow resolution like so to 4K, this is going to dramatically lower our performance in our scene, but it makes our shadows a lot more realistic and sharp, and makes them look much, much nicer. So if you can raise the resolution on your shadows, I'd highly recommend it in Eevee, but wow, that actually changes the definition of the light. That's crazy. Wow. I don't know if I've ever seen that before. Well, I can kind of show you how important increasing this resolution on the shadows can be for accuracy and realism, but also just to make them less aliased and pixelated. So keep that in mind if you're rendering out in Eevee. There's also these indirect lighting settings, which, again, this is not a super useful thing if you're doing stylized animations, but if you go to Shift A and add light probes, this is basically how you bake them out into your scene. So you can kind of simulate bounce lighting in your scenes, which can make them feel a lot more realistic. But again, I don't use that super much because I like stylized stuff. The only other thing I want to talk about is film. This is extremely, extremely important. This is how you render in using transparency in Blender. So by clicking transparent right here, this makes our background transparent. So if I pressed 0 and did a render again, so I got a render image, now our background is completely transparent. Otherwise, if we didn't do this, our background would just render out as black pixels. So this is super useful if you need to composite anything in your animations, which you probably do want to do that. So if you want to have like the background be colored differently than the foreground, you want to do some kind of stylized effect in the background in like, you know, an editing software, that is an extremely, extremely useful setting. I use this constantly. It's one of the most important settings in this tab by far, is this transparent setting. I don't even know what filter size or overscan does. I would ignore them. Just mess with transparent. So yeah, simplify is really good to have. It is great for animation because it basically will limit how high a subdivision modifier can get. So if you have a rig with a lot of subdivision modifiers on it, and you need more performance as you're making an animation, which a lot of rigs will have subdivision modifiers. I know that the rig I have right here has a bunch of subdivision modifiers. So if I enabled simplify, turn this way down, she becomes super blocky, which, you know, doesn't look fantastic, but it makes the frame rate in our viewport a lot higher because there's less for the computer to think about and process. So that's what subdivision does. Very useful for animation. If you're running into issues getting with your scene slowing down dramatically, mess with the simplify setting, because it's really important. Make sure to lower that max subdivision level to like 1 or 0 even. I don't know why it's at 6 by default. That seems really extreme. And yeah, the only other one I want to talk about today is color management. This is probably one of the most common mistakes I've seen beginners make in Blender, where they'll be making a scene kind of like this one, where it's let's turn off simplify so she looks less crunchy. It's a scene like this one, right? Where this is clearly a stylized character and a stylized art style. You know, we're kind of pushing things quite a bit here when it comes to the art style we're shooting for, but they'll leave their color management on the Blender default, which in this version of Blender was called Filmic, but in modern versions of Blender, it's called AGX. No, they're still Filmic, but by default, Blender is an AGX, which is another Filmic-esque color standard, I would say. So my recommendation to you is, if you're doing stylized characters or anything like that, so say you're doing, you know, cartoon or an anime style in Blender, or you're doing things like animating Team Fortress 2 characters, which are from like a stylized game and a stylized art style, you absolutely do not want to be using Filmic. You want to be using standard, because that is the view transform for stylized rendering, for NPR stuff. So this is what standard looks like on this model, for example, and this is what Filmic looks like in this model. So you can see that it just looks lifeless, and the colors look completely wrong and like desaturated, and it looks bad. But if I put this to standard, we have our saturation back, everything looks colorful and poppy, and it looks great. So standard is what you want to do for non-photorealistic animations. If you're going for photorealism, if you're really shooting, if you're like doing architectural visualization and stuff, of course, use Filmic or use AGX. I don't know how to pronounce that. AGX? AGX? I don't know. But that's what you want to use for photorealism, for non-photorealism, for stylized stuff. Like I was just showing you, make sure to use standard. That's one of the most common mistakes I see beginners make in Blender. Now, there are two ways of rendering your scenes out: animation renders and image renders. That's what we just did to demonstrate motion blur was an image render. But there's an even faster way of doing it, which are called viewport renders. That's what we're going to talk about in the next video, along with all of this tab, which is the output properties, which are super, super important to understand. So I'll see you in that video. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the Patreon if you want to become a part of our amazing, amazing community, and have a great day. Whether you want to render out the very final, most polished, beautiful render of your animation you've ever seen, or if you simply want to render out a preview of your animation in order to send it to friends on Discord, just to preview it for yourself or share it on social media, we're going to cover all of that in this video, and how to really get the most bang out of your buck when it comes to rendering out animations in Blender. So let's jump into it. Now, there's two ways you're going to want to render out your animations typically. As I mentioned, you know, quick and dirty renders, just to preview something for yourself or for social media if you want to share it very quickly on Discord or whatever, or full-on animation renders with fancy sampling and motion blur. If you want to do a really quick render of your animation where you don't care about having motion blur, you don't care about having all the fancy settings in the world, you can simply go to View, Viewport Render Animation. That will render only what you have in your playback range, or your preview range rather. So it's not going to render out every frame we have in our scene, because if we turn off our preview range like so, you're going to see that we have frame 1 to frame 250 set up. So if we go to turn this on and then do View, Viewport Render Animation, it's just going to render out our preview range, which is those very limited frames we have set up here, which is frame 6 to frame 14. And it's going to output those frames in where we see output here to this folder on our computer, which is currently set to temp, which, you know, your computer just has a temp folder, and that's where Blender outputs these things by default. As you can see here, those are our frames. So even if we're doing a test render, that's where they're going to go, and it's the same place that your full-on, full-fat renders of animations are going to go as well. So if I go to render here, render animation, this is going to be like the full fat animation render. This isn't a preview render. This is going to contain things like more sampling, motion blur if you have motion blur enabled, because viewport renders don't actually contain motion blur, because that's kind of computationally expensive. It takes longer to render. So if I go to render animation here and pull this up, you're going to see that we're actually starting from frame 1, and we're going past our preview range here. Because remember, full-on animation renders don't care about your preview range. They're going to render every frame you have set in your playback range without your preview range. So if I turn this off, that's where it's going to render this entire animation from. It's going to start from frame 1 and go to frame 250. If we turn this back on, it's going to completely ignore our playback range here because it doesn't care about that. That's just for us when we're animating something and kind of previewing it, or if we're going to view viewport render animation, that's the only times Blender really cares about your preview range, right? So I'm going to go to our render here, and we can actually cancel our render by either pressing escape on our keyboard. That cancels our render. Or you can just press the little X button that appears at the bottom of Blender. However, if we go to our output tab once again and open up our folder here, you're going to see that it renders all of our animation frames as individual frames. And in this case here, they're actually PNGs. So that can be a little confusing, right? Because you might be thinking, well, this is an animation. What am I supposed to do with all these PNG images? That's because this is an image sequence render for an animation, right? If we wanted to render out something like an MP4, we can switch our file format on to FFmpeg video, and then switch our container to MPEG-4. That will render out our animation as an MP4, though keep in mind it's not going to have any audio because our audio codec is set to no audio by default. I don't know why, but there you go. I'm going to switch that on over to AAC in our case here. Now, if I had any audio in my scene, it would render out alongside this render, right? And again, if I go to View, Viewport Render Animation, it's just going to render our preview range that we have set here. And again, you can set your preview range by pressing P, click dragging a certain playback range in your timeline, graph editor, or Dopesheet, and bada bing, bada boom, we have it all set up, which is pretty cool. But if I don't want to just render a preview range, I want to render every single frame in our scene from frame 1 to 250 in our case here. Go to Render, Animation, and this will also do our fancy motion blur, as we can see right now from all of our moving objects getting super, super blurry. So that is how that works. That is how file formats work when you're rendering. That's how you change the folder on your computer. You literally just click this folder, navigate to wherever on your computer you want your frames to be output to, click on that folder, and then click accept. And if you want your frames or image sequences or video files to be named something else, you can just type in, I'll call it test animation, like so. Say that's what I wanted it to be called. And then I went to View, Viewport Render Animation again. Very quickly, it's going to be done rendering. And if I go into this folder, you're going to see test animation 003-0014.mp4 was just rendered out. And those numbers right there are just the frames it starts the render at and the frame it stopped the render at, just so you have an idea of which playback range that's being rendered out as, right? If we scroll up here, we have two extremely important settings. Frame range is something we don't really need to worry about because I'm usually just changing the frame range in the timeline, Dopesheet, or graph editor anyway. I don't really care about navigating it here. If I want to change my play range, I'm almost always changing it here anyway. So you can pretty safely ignore that most of the time. Just another way to do the same thing. However, what is super, super important is this frame rate setting right here, because if you're rendering out at 24 FPS, first of all, that's the standard for film. Almost every Pixar movie, Illumination movie, or any animated movie you've seen in the past 10 years is probably running back at 24 FPS or something very close to it. It's standard for a reason. It really simplifies things. It's less frames to worry about when you're making a hand-keyed animation. It makes a lot of sense to animate at 24 FPS for film. However, if you render out your animations without motion blur at 24 FPS, more often than not, they're going to look super, super stuttery. So if you are animating at 24 FPS, I would highly recommend you enable motion blur for your final render. You don't have to enable motion blur early on. As you're previewing your renders and as you're doing your viewport render animations, you don't need motion blur enabled. You can't even render out motion blur with a viewport render animation anyway. It's just for preview purposes. However, if you do want that really smooth, clean look that an animated film often has, I would recommend you turn on motion blur for your final renders because it's going to make them feel a lot less stuttery at 24 FPS. However, you don't have to animate at 24 FPS, of course. You can animate something like 30 FPS. 30 FPS is really, really good for things like video games. And in fact, if you're making animations for a video game, I would recommend you use 30 FPS because that's a lot more of a clean interval for video games. Video games are usually running at 30 FPS or 60 FPS or 120 FPS, or at least that's what they're targeting on a console, for example. And at frame rates like those, it kind of just divides more evenly for 30 FPS, so I would not recommend animating at 24 FPS if you're animating for a video game. It makes a lot more sense to animate at 30 because it just divides more cleanly and is pretty standard stuff for animating for video games. And if you want alpha in your renders, which essentially means that the background is transparent, you need to go to your render tab right here, scroll down to this film drop down right here, and make sure transparent is enabled. Now, if I made another render of my scene by going to the output tab, switching this back to PNG because MPEG video, that's not going to support transparency. You're going to need to do PNG. Not only are you going to need to do PNG, but you're also going to need to do RGBA for alpha to make sure you have a clean, transparent background. Then if I go to render image like so, as you can see by zooming in on our image here, our background is actually alpha, which means that there is transparency in our image and we can put whatever we want in the background here, which is really useful for compositing our animations. But let me show you a totally real world example of how an animation render with alpha actually works. For my actual animation projects, I am using PNG renders with RGBA. And if we go on over to Premiere here, this is not a tutorial on how to use editing software, but I want to show you a visual example of how this actually works in the real world, right? That's the whole point of this whole series, to really show you how these things are actually done by someone who actually does this every single day. Because I don't want to do theory, I want to do reality. So the way I do it is I will render out my animation in Blender when I'm done animating it as a PNG sequence with alpha. And as you can see here, this is our little part of our animation we have here, where if we look at the preview here, there is no background behind this. It's all black pixels. But as you can see by toggling this on and off, it's transparent. The background is totally separate and right here. I actually have to turn off both of these for you to get a better preview of that. So having them be separate like that is super powerful because I can click on our image sequence now and do effects like this little blue border. Pretty subtle, but you can kind of see it if you look along the edges of him. There's this blue border that I'm adding on him. In compositing here, I'm doing color correction on him as well to make the colors really pop and come alive a lot more. And I'm able to do that totally independently of the background behind him because we are rendering this out with a transparent background in Blender by, again, making sure we're using RGBA under PNG and also making sure we have film transparent enabled. That's super important. Make sure you're actually getting alpha in your animation renders, right? Then I'm just pressing Control-I to import an image sequence and importing them in like so. I'm using Premiere Pro in this case here, but I do not think you actually need to be using Premiere Pro to do this. Most video editing software should be able to support image sequence importing, and I don't think you're gonna really have much issue doing it in other software like Sony Vegas or HitFilm or anything like that. So yeah, that's basically how it works. If you want to render out a quick preview of your animation, go to View, Viewport Render Animation, and make sure you have a playback range if you only want to do a specific part. Render it out as an FPEG video, as MPEG 4, and with an audio codec if you actually need audio. But if you're doing a full-on render, make sure to use an image sequence, especially for bigger scale projects. This will allow you to use alpha, but it also means you don't need to re-render your entire video file in case Blender crashes during your render, if you just need to change a small part of your render. Because I can, for example, if I just want to change the end of this animation, where it's like, maybe I want his hand to raise in a different way, or maybe I want to add a blink just at this part, I wouldn't have to re-render the entire image sequence because it's an image sequence. I can just override the frames at the end there. However, if this was just one big MP4 file and I changed the end of my animation here, I would have to re-render the entire MP4 completely from scratch. And if this was like a full fat render with motion blur, that would take a really, really long time. It would be very painful. And if Blender crashed or something, your entire video file would get corrupt. So for more ambitious renders like this, I would highly recommend you use image sequences. It just makes the most sense for animation projects like that. So that about covers it. If I'm looking at my notes here, that is it. So thank you so much for watching. I hope this series was helpful because this is basically the last video I did. We've covered everything you need to know about learning animation. I hope to cover modeling, animation principles, and more in the future, especially character modeling because I know that's highly requested. So I hope you stick around for that. I hope you enjoyed and learned something from the series, and have a great day. Congratulations on finishing this tutorial. It might feel like a small step, but you're now one step closer to animation mastery. And if you want access to an exclusive Discord community, exclusive rewards, and help ensure that I can keep making tutorials for you just like this one, check out my Patreon.